afternoon, ladies. Welcome back to Sistah's Story Time with your sister ChayaFyah. Today's book is geared especially towards the Sister for Sisters sex ed group on Facebook. I am currently streaming live from YouTube as well as in the group. So if you haven't already joined, you can do so by clicking the link in the description or from my Facebook page or the Sister for Sisters group if you're already a member. You'll see it listed as an associated group somewhere on the side. So we are in the last chapters of this book. We have covered the taboos, the popular beliefs in the public, and images in literature concerning the menstrual cycle. In the last chapters, we will cover menopause, the life cycle of the menses, the part that men play in the menstrual cycle, and finally on lifting the curse. If you haven't already listened to the beginning of this book, you can find the beginning on the Hebrew Truth Music page on the Facebook group, or by using the blog talk link in the description below. If you would like to purchase the book, the link is also in the description. If you would like to donate to the Sister for Sisters ministry to save a sister, the ways to donate are in the description as well. Again, this is called The Curse, A Cultural History of Menstruation. The Menopause, Chapter 20. From leeches to estrogen, the menopause and medical options. Menopause, from the Greek words for month and cessation, marks the end of the menstrual flow. The word is sometimes used interchangeably with the broader term climacteric, from the Greek words meaning rung of the ladder and critical time. The climacteric refers to the few years before and after the actual cessation of bleeding and encompasses all the physical and emotional symptoms a woman may experience around the time her period stops. Other expressions for the menopause are change of life, critical time, the change, the dangerous age, and the dodging time. The menopause is the last phase of the menstrual cycle. As with every other aspect of menstruation, the same old taboos appear among both primitives and psychoanalysts regarding the menopause. Menstruation stops when the ovaries cease functioning. One authority has suggested that women stop bleeding when the ovaries have exhausted their egg supply, an unlikely explanation because a newborn girl comes equipped with over 500,000 eggs. Another doctor thinks that a reduction in the Graafian follicles or egg sacs causes the ovaries to stop functioning. It is known, however, that the cessation in ovarian activity means a sharp reduction in the supply of estrogen, the female sex hormone, and it is the loss of estrogen that causes many of the more noticeable symptoms and side effects of the climacteric. The average American woman stops menstruating around the age of 50, although menopause can occur normally at any time between the ages of 40 and 60. Sorry. A century ago, age at menopause could not have been a subject for scientific investigation. Average life expectancy was low, and the majority of European and American women did not live to experience menopause. Interesting. This fact did not prevent widespread speculation about what race or class of women would menstruate the longest. The results and prejudices are similar to those involved in speculations about age at menarche. One doctor thought that Red Indian women menstruate beyond the age of 50, but that the teeming millions of Chinese, the end of the cycle comes before the 40th year. Today, the American woman, with an average life expectancy of 80, is likely to outlive her ovaries by about 30 years. Premature menopause, menopause before the age of 40, is experienced by about 8% of all women. Perhaps the earliest case on record is the age of 9. One 19th century gynecologist reported the case of a Hungarian Jewess, fat from her youth, who had her first menstruation at the age of 9, was married at 15 and a half, and went through the menopause at the age of 17. Explanations for age at menopause reflect the assumptions of the male experts who offer them. One 19th century physician said that bad news could bring on an early menopause. He related the unfortunate story of Elizabeth C., who stopped menstruating at the age of 30 when one day, as she was nursing her baby, her husband dropped dead at her feet. The mother's milk turned to water and her periods never returned. In the same century, a Dr. Andrew Currier explained that irregular and unwomanly occupations could cause an early menopause. Those workers most in danger were fishwives, metal workers, day laborers, cooks, and laundresses. Surely this is not woman's work, wrote the doctor, or we would not see such pitiful spectacles of decrepit and wrinkled and worn out creatures at a period when the blush should still be on their cheeks. Cooks, he thought, had an early menopause from overeating, laundresses from being exposed to high temperatures. Other causes for premature menopause, said the same doctor, were alcohol, poverty, opium, typhoid, and excessive sexual indulgence. Dr. Currier's speculations express the moral and class biases of a comfortable Victorian paterfamilias. To this day, there is no proven correlation between a woman's menopausal age and her socioeconomic class. Premature menopause is almost always the result of a hormonal imbalance, whether natural or surgically induced. So, too, those women who remain fertile into their 90s owe that pleasure or pain to the levels of estrogen being produced in their bodies rather than to sexual restraint or working conditions. The oldest age at menopause on record is 104. If we take the title of the hormone advocate Robert A. Wilson's book at face value, then 104 is not a very remarkable age at all. Women can be, he claims, feminine forever. The most common physical symptom of the climacteric is irregular menstrual flow. Another is hot flashes, sensations of warmth in the upper chest and face, often followed by perspiration and chills. Doctors differ on how many women have significant menopausal symptoms. One says 25%. Wilson, the author of Feminine Forever, says 88%. The Victorian gynecologist Edward Tilt decreed that a major difficulty of the climacteric was a gradual loss of feminine grace. At change of life, women begin to look masculine. Their bones either stick out or are sunken in fat. Their skin gets flabby, and tweezers are sometimes required to remove stray hairs from the face. In Feminine Forever, Wilson gives much the same portrait. Especially grim in Wilson's description of postmenopausal breasts, he calls breasts psychological organs. So important are they to a woman's sense of self esteem. After menopause, when estrogen and progesterone sink to a low level, the breasts begin to shrivel and sag. Once the supply of these two nourishing hormones is cut off, the breasts become pendulous, wrinkled, and flabby. Often the skin of the breast coarsens and is covered with scales. The breasts lose their erotic sensitivity and sometimes do not respond to pain stimuli. Only timely estrogen replacement therapy can prevent this premature decline of a woman's symbol of femininity. Breast flab is not all women have to look forward to. Among other blessings of the climacteric, Wilson lists a stiff and unyielding vagina, aching joints, palpitating organs, frequent urination, itching skin, loss of memory, the inability to concentrate, and dryness of the mouth, nose, and eyes. Another doctor observes that menopausal women are often allergic to detergents and to certain kinds of floor polishes. Some researchers have associated the menopause with bone decalcification, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and heart disease. But the disease that women fear most, one that has been associated with the menopause since Galen, is cancer. Popular books and magazine articles almost always warn the menopausal woman that irregular bleeding, particularly any marked increase in the flow, may be a sign of cancer. We are conditioned to think that irregularity means malignancy. Although it is indeed prudent for any person, regardless of age or sex, to be aware of the danger signals of cancer, the dwelling on cancer during the menopause can compound a woman's negative attitude toward aging. Among the 100 women whom Bernice Newgarten interviewed about menopausal attitudes, only 4 saw the end of their periods as a problem of the menopause, but many mentioned the fear of cancer. Most of us know women who have developed cancer of the breast, cervix, or uterus at a time in their lives that coincided with the menopause. The average age for the menopause for American women is 49. The peak age for cancer of the cervix is 48. The highest incidence of cancer of the ovary, a difficult disease to detect, occurs between the ages of 55 and 65. Wilson sees the uterus as a possible breeding ground for cancer, but one that can be controlled through estrogen and hysterectomy. Wilson looks forward to the day when hysterectomy will be accepted as a general preventive route. If your uterus can be has been removed, Wilson writes, estrogen therapy will provide all its benefits without the annoyance of menstrual bleeding. You are a lucky woman indeed. A lucky, i.e., healthy or wealthy woman living in London in the 1850s could, if she had the courage to talk about intimate problems with the male doctor, make an appointment with Edward Tilt. Tilt had a wide range of solutions to the problem of menopause, among them mineral, mineral water, morphine, syrup of iron and potassium, exercise, traveling, bandaging of limbs, sedatives, and abdominal belts. His preferred method of treatment, however, was bleeding, general venesection. Tilt reasoned that although many women grew stronger during the menopause because their bodies used up the nutrition in the unexpelled blood, many others suffered from the body's failure to dispose of it. Severe headaches were a sign that the woman was storing up the excess blood in her head. If her arm were bled, the unneeded blood would leave the body and her well being would be restored. Tilt also liked applying leeches to the anus in the case of hemorrhoids, but behind the ears or at the nape of the neck for menopausal disorders. Bleeding was a widely recommended procedure in the 19th century for many ailments. It was particularly useful for the menopause. Tilt argued because it was an imitation of nature. Tilt's bleeding of 12 ounces of blood from the arm of a 51-year-old patient is alleged to have reduced her dizziness, flushes, and perspiration. A woman consulting the American gynecologist Andrew Currier in the 1890s would have been told that leeches were still an effective remedy for congested genitals, but that venesection was old fashioned and ineffectual. In his book, The Menopause, Currier attacked those physicians, such as Tilt, who frightened women with their negative attitudes toward the menopause and who were, in Currier's words, bleeders, pukers, and purgers. The great cure, according to Currier, was not bleeding, but surgery. Riding on the wave of progress evoked by Robert Batty's invention of female castration in 1872, Carrier proclaimed its merits in the treatment of the menopause. He advocated artificial menopause, the removal of any organ that directly affects the menstrual process. Be thorough, he advised his colleagues. If you remove the fallopian tubes, then you might as well remove the ovaries too, because without the tubes, the ovarian function is gone. Remove the whole ovary instead of just part of one, and remove the ovaries in the case of any new growth, benign or malignant. Of course, one always stumbled across the rare patient for whom surgery offered no salvation. This would include some who had long been subject to vicious habits, to the use of alcohol, chloral, opium, etc. Carrier's method is still highly favored among American doctors. Apparently, 63% of American women between the ages of 50 and 64 have had artificial menopause. The methods may vary, but the end result is the same as it was almost a century ago: the literal castration of the female. Although surgery is the preferred American technique for destroying the function of a woman's ovaries and her uterus, another is called radiation menopause. This controversial treatment can be achieved through x ray of the pelvic area or through circulating radium in the uterus through a tube. With the latter method, there is said to be a greater risk of uterine cancer. With both methods, there are some unpleasant side effects, including uncontrollable bleeding and loss of sexual desire. Besides surgery and radiation, other modern proposals for cheating nature have been monkey gland transplants and injections of the cells of an unborn lamb. One doctor has ironically suggested grafting young ovaries into menopausal women as a way to eliminate the process of aging. But the most widely acclaimed cure for the menopause, the one that made headlines in 1966, is estrogen replacement therapy. The two female hormones that affect the menstrual cycle are estrogen and progesterone, which are produced by certain cells of the ovaries and possibly by the adrenal glands. The decrease in estrogen levels bring on the menopause, although some researchers say that 40% of all women maintain moderate hormonal activity even after the menopause. Estrogen was first isolated in 1923 by Allen and Doisy. It is the general name for three collective hormones: estradiol, estrone, and estriol, that are converted into usable substances in the liver. To make his first drop of estrogen in the 1920s, Doisy used up the ovaries of 80,000 sows. Another source of natural estrogen is Australian clover, which has been said to make grazing sheep sterile. But the most common source of natural estrogen is the urine of pregnant mares. Today, most estrogen is produced synthetically and is administered primarily in pill form. There are also some local preparations prescribed for women who cannot take estrogen orally. These creams help to restore the vaginal tissue. Their primary deficiency is that they are too easily absorbed. Another form of estrogen, not currently in wide use but destined to be if the present trend continues, is a hormone pellet implanted under the buttocks. One English doctor who recommends this treatment says that the implantation method is superior to all others. It is weaker than a daily dosage. The hormones are not apt to lose their effectiveness in the liver. There is no way of affecting the stomach or intestines. There is little risk of embolism, and there is the psychological advantage of not having to think about taking medicine. This very optimistic physician has had excellent results with the more than 1,000 women he has treated. Like Wilson, he sees estrogen therapy as a revolutionary discovery that will retard the aging process. Others have been less optimistic, less willing to proclaim estrogen as the elixir of youth. The drug has had many reported side effects, including a high incidence of heart disease and blood clotting. Synthetic estrogens, particularly the substance known as diethylstilbestrol or DES, have been linked with cancer. Other synthetic estrogens have been connected with liver disturbances and shifts in blood sugar levels. Defenders of estrogen therapy have answered these charges. Huggins, for example, won a Nobel Prize for discovering that oral contraceptives, which contain estrogen and progesterone, are more likely to reduce cancer than cause it. Wilson, in his more than 27 years of prescribing estrogen for menopausal women, had not a single woman develop cancer, although the odds were that 18 of the 304 women would contract the disease. As we write this 1976, convincing evidence is beginning to appear that links excessive estrogen therapy with an increased risk of cancer. The choice of estrogen therapy must be a highly individual one. We think all women should educate themselves about this issue so that they can make intelligent individual decisions when the choice becomes necessary. All women should visit a gynecologist for an annual checkup and pap smear. It might be a good idea to make an annual visit to a medical library as well. There is no waiting in line and the service is free. The reference book called Biological Abstracts contains, under the category Menopause, a summary of the medical findings for that year on that topic. It is not too difficult to learn what is being said about the menopause and by whom. The more technical essays tend to avoid the kind of rhetoric that categorizes Wilson's book, for the main fault of Feminine Forever lies not in the medicine, but in the moralizing. Wilson's insistent theme is that women are delightful creatures whose beauty must be preserved. Each man, he argues, marries an Aphrodite or a Helen of Troy. The sensitive doctor is the one who keeps Helen glowing through the dismal years of her middle age. A woman's physical appeal is her starting capital in the venture of life, the ante which lets her into the game. Wilson writes in defense of his theory. One gynecologist told us that Wilson's reputation in medical circles has suffered because of his evangelical approach to estrogen therapy for all. The fact is, all women in their climacteric do not require estrogen therapy. The ones who do get it from their doctors as needed. No competent or honorable gynecologist face to face with an anxious 49-year-old woman would dare to promise eternal youth as Wilson does from the safety of the printed page. In the foreword to Feminine Forever, Dr. Greenblatt praises his colleague. Like a gallant knight, he has come to rescue his fair lady, not at the time of her bloom and flowering, but in her despairing years, at a time of her life when the preservation and prolongation of her femaleness are so paramount. But in emphasizing a woman's breast and legs rather than her intelligence or skill, the gallant knight reinforces the most destructive stereotypes in our sexist society. Nor can we be thoroughly convinced, as Wilson is, that estrogen therapy is woman's salvation. What seems true in one age can be judged folly in another. Edward Tilt had the most knightly of intentions, surely, when he sapped away his menopausal patients' strength by removing the blood from their arms in imitation of nature. To thumb one's nose at Mother Nature now during the estrogen craze would be a disservice to those women who had little need either for hormone replacement or identification with Aphrodite. Chapter 21, Psychology and the Menopausal Menace. Victorian medicine men knew in their hearts that during the menopause a woman could expect to have mental problems. According to Dr. Edward Tilt, the change of life, woman was susceptible to certain mental diseases, among them morbid irrationality, minor forms of hysteria, melancholia, and the impulses to drink spirits, to steal, and perchance to murder. Freud, although he did not see the menopause as a disease, nonetheless thought it to be a stage of potential crises, a time when previously undisturbed women could become neurotic. Often, said Freud, menopausal women became quarrelsome and obstinate, petty and stingy, show typical sadistic and anal erotic features which they did not show before. Freud's occasional perceptions of the menopause, like his comments on the monarch, were fully developed by the analyst Helen Douche. Douche viewed the menopause as the third edition of the infantile stage, the second being the monarch. During both of these traumatic times, she argued, women act out certain unconscious fantasies. The first menstruation is fraught with fears of castration and the lost children. The last is filled with fantasies of rape and prostitution. Her theory that the monarch is the moment at which a woman becomes the servant of the species justifies her view of the menopause as the stage at which the woman's service to the species ends. The woman becomes biologically useless. She can have no more children. Here is another instance of psychoanalysts converting the complaints of a few women seeking psychiatric help into a universal theory of female sexuality. The medical psychiatric community considers the menarche, menstruation, and now the menopause conditions to be treated, and their theories of treatment spill over into definitions of the normally functioning woman. Douche's influence can be seen in the writings of other analysts and popularizers of psychoanalytic ideas. Eric Erickson, for example, writers that writes that when a woman's womb is empty, she experiences pain. Her grief for lost children, reiterated at each menstruation, becomes during the menopause a permanent scar. Joseph Reingold, in The Fear of Being a Woman, relates the menopause to his theory of maternal destructiveness. The menopause is a traumatic event accompanied by an isolation by loss, the loss of the childbearing capacity. Some women make a career of the menopause, claims Reingold. How do these dismissed servants of the race behave during their menopausal years? Well, writes one doctor, unless they have the right outlet, menopausal women are apt to become mischief makers, developing a heightened interest in their married sons and daughters, and often becoming a great menace as meddlesome mothers in law. The menacing mother in law is a major stereotype for the menopausal woman. Another is the television addict. Morton Hunt, in a book entitled Inappropriately Her Infinite Variety, has a rather one dimensional idea about the menopausal type. She is foolish and what people call typically feminine. Her time is spent pursuing astrologists and palm readers, writing letters to advice columnists, watching television, playing bridge, and making lemming like migrations to see visiting movie stars. Philip Wiley's menacing mom, the American Cinderella gone to flab, exhibits caprices that Wiley labels menopausal. These caprices are of a menopausal nature at best: hot flashes, rage, infantilism, weeping, sentimentality, peculiar appetite. In The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir also presents a mommish portrait of the menopausal woman, although she places her middle class menace more clearly within a cultural context than what Wiley does. Because woman lives in a patriarchal culture where she is denied selfhood, argues de Beauvoir, she will inevitably behave in an infantile manner. Relying on both Douche and Wiley as sources, de Beauvoir describes the menopausal woman in rather negative terms. Denied identity by the male society, she retreats to infantile fantasies of what might have been. At the verge of a new independence, the menopausal woman will usually reject it. She babbles to men in a childish voice and with naive glances of admiration, and she chatters on about when she was a little girl. She chirps instead of talking. She claps her hands. She bursts out laughing. Some women may revive their abandoned dreams of playing the piano or painting pictures. Others become willing dupes of religious or spiritual happiness peddlers. Restless, irritable, tormented by the flesh, she is likely to seek the attention of young men and will, in fact, buy that attention if it does not come freely. Finished and outdated in a culture that has no use for her. The menopausal woman tyrannizes over her sons and daughters, even promoting the daughter's abortion in order to keep the privilege of maternity to herself. Some women, says de Bouvier, bless the appearance of a war or a famine, for then their knitting will be needed. Of all menopausal women, says the French philosopher, it is the American who is the worst. She must agree with Wiley that the American mom cannot think or read, knows nothing of science or art. De Bouvier goes so far as to blame the American woman for the decline of literature. Bestsellers are written for the American mom market to entertain idle women in search of escape. Fortunately for the future of the race, some writers give more humane and realistic assessments of the menopausal personality. The, the analyst Clara Thompson, for one, thinks the menopause is a threat primarily to two distinct types of women: those who have postponed living until too late, and those who have managed to maintain a feeling of importance and value only through the adulation of men. Most of the hazards of the menopause are culturally induced. Thompson reports the fact that among Chinese women, there are almost no menopausal problems because older women in China are given power and respect as they reach maturity. The psychoanalyst George Devereaux has noted similar circumstances among Mojave women. In that society, the menopause is a sign of achievement. Mojave women are free to work, to flirt, and to be wise during their middle years. In overemphasizing the plight of the white American woman of the middle class, de Beauvoir neglects this broader cultural view. Today, a more common theme is the menopause as a rebirth, a time when woman is freed from childbearing and child rearing, freed to a new enjoyment of sex and a renewed dedication to her work. Women writing about themselves have actually sounded this note throughout history, but it seems to have been ignored by the clinicians. The suffragist Eliza Farnham, writing in the 1860s, saw menopause as a time of secret joy, of spiritual growth, or super exaltation. She attributed the negative attitudes toward menopause to masculine errors. Anna Garland Spencer, an American writer of the earlier 20th century, found in The Change of Life a new freedom. Released from the ties of home and childbearing, the woman in her middle years can have a life as straight as man's, and the curves that had required consideration at their weakest point are no longer a part of her existence. Clelia Moshe, the author of Health and the Woman Movement, claimed that women are taught to dread the menopause. Yet those women who are busy and useful, who have absorbing occupations, have little to worry about. More recent testimonies indicate that if a woman has a positive attitude toward the menopause, this stage of life need not be a threat. 7 California women, most of them postmenopausal, spoke on videotape of their feelings during the climacteric. Only 2 had experienced any anxiety in the menopause. One of the women found menopause to be a liberation, a more joyful time than she had had in the preceding 20 years. The 100 women in the Nargarten study were generally happy about their own menopause. One woman said, I'm so happy about not menstruating anymore. I could dance with joy. I was looking forward to it for years. No longer bound to their rhythms or their families, postmenopausal women are freed from any of the social and biological restrictions that patriarchy imposes on their lives. They have no need for babysitters or birth control. They are in the position to establish, perhaps for the first time in their lives, a separate identity. Many women celebrate this new liberty with a divorce Others, however, discover a renewed sexual life with their long-term mates. For it is a myth that with the end of the menstrual cycle comes an end to sexual desire. Some, it is true, may use the menopause as an excuse for sexual denial, but only those women who never liked sex in the first place. A 33-year-old woman who went through premature menopause was very much worried that her sexual appeal would diminish, but her doctor sagely remarked, "Men don't marry us for our periods." When she told her husband the bad news that they would soon be unable to have any more children, he answered, "But honey, we weren't seriously thinking about having any more anyway." Her husband's tenderness and understanding, plus the decreasing need for contraceptive devices, made their sexual relationship more satisfying than ever. Extremists in the past have predicted either complete frigidity or uncontrollable nymphomania as the sexual response to the menopause. However, a number of recent studies show that there is a very little change in sexual attitude for the majority of women during the climacteric. Some of Thompson's patients continue to have a strong sex life into their 70s. The majority of women in Newgarten's study found little or no change in their sexual attitudes as they entered the menopause. Of the 35 women who did experience a change, they were equally divided on whether sex got better or worse. Newgarten and some other current investigators have concluded that it is not physiological change, but rather the cultural attitude toward aging, which creates depression or negative self concepts in menopausal women. As women gain increased control of their own bodies, as they continue to talk to each other about menstruation, the menopause, and other socially taboo topics, they will help to clear away some of the misconceptions about female sexuality. There is much in print concerning the menopausal menace. Perhaps this is because women's silence for so long have had too many authorities describe them. But women's stories exist in letters, in journals, in unpublished manuscripts. In these documents, as in the published works of many, are to be found the women who have been too busy or too committed to flock to movie houses or the arms of adolescent men. As their lives are made public, the menopausal menace shall, like the mom and the mother in law, resume her human and unmenacing dimensions. Chapter 22, November of the Bodies, the Menopause in Literature. Until the last quarter of the 19th century, the word menopause did not exist in the English language. Andrew Marvell and Sir Thomas Browne, English writers of the 17th century, had used the word climacter to indicate a critical stage in a man's life, but not in a woman's. The sexual decline of a woman's body, generally called change of life, was not a significant theme in British or American literature until the 20th century. The absence of women's voices from the centuries old record of the human experience must surely be responsible for this void in literature. On the other hand, there are countless references to old age in European literature, from the Greeks to the moderns. The process of aging was a concern of Euripides, Shakespeare, Donne, Hugo, Tolstoy, Baudelaire, T.S. Eliot, even Simone de Beauvoir in The Coming of Age. Although she provides a thorough analysis of the theme of old age in literature, gives no specific attention to woman's change of life. We shall try to fill in the record here. One of the earliest and most introspective writers on the fear of reproductive decay was Elizabeth Barrett Browning. In a letter written to Robert Browning during their courtship, Elizabeth Barrett warned her fiance that marrying her would be like emptying his water gourds into the sand. The sand suggests dryness or absence of fluid, the sterility of the womb. Her famed sonnets from the Portuguese, written shortly before the elopement, show similar fears of barrenness. Elizabeth Barrett was then 39 years old, too old, she feared, for a fruitful marriage. She describes herself in images of dust, ashes, and decay. In Sonnet 18, she remarks that her youth is gone. My days of youth went yesterday. My hair no longer bounds to my foot's glee, nor plant I it from rose or myrtle tree, as girls do anymore. In Sonnet 4, she compares her body to a dilapidated house. Look up and see the casement broken in, the bats and owlets, builders in the roof. Elizabeth Barrett is communicating in these premarital sonnets a dread of her approaching change of life. But in fact, she was not sterile. She bore one son and suffered four miscarriages during her marriage, the last being her most serious illness since leaving England for the healthier climate of Italy. The desire for a child is strong in the menopause of Joanna Burton, Joe Christmas's mistress in Faulkner's Light in August. It was as if she knew somehow that time was short, that autumn was almost upon her, without knowing yet the exact significance of autumn. Like Anne Sexton's November of the Body, Joanna Burton's autumn signifies the ending of fertility, the last chance for bearing a child. Miss Burton tells Joe Christmas that she is pregnant, but her body has lied. In his shame and disgust, Christmas strikes her, calling her an old woman. You haven't gotten any baby, he said. You never had one. There is not anything the matter with you except being old. You just got old and it happened to you, and now you are not any good anymore. The unnamed it is, of course, the menopause. Some menopausal women in literature who want a child meet a happier fate than Joanna Burton did. The Old Testament, for example, records the story of Sarah, the barren wife of Abraham, who, though old, conceived and bare Abraham a son, Isaac, in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Genesis 21:2. There is a parallel legend in the New Testament in the book of Luke. Zacharias and Elizabeth, both now well stricken in years, have no child, 1 and 7. But an angel comes to Zacharias telling him that the barren wife will bear a son to be named John. When the angel comes to Mary to announce the blessedness of her womb, he informs Mary that Elizabeth, her cousin, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. For with God nothing shall be impossible. 1:36 through 37. Shortly afterward, Mary visits her cousin. When Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the babe leaped in her womb. 141. In both of these stories from the Bible, it is the Lord, not the mothers, who are primarily responsible for the conceptions. In both, a son is born, not a daughter. The birth of a son is the wish granted to an Irish peasant woman in Jack London's story, Samuel. But in London's story, the menopausal pregnancy is seen by the people as the work of the devil rather than the work of God. Margaret Hennon, the central character of Samuel, is the mother of 6 sons and 6 daughters, but the sons named Samuel in honor of Margaret's brother do not survive. After the third Samuel's death by drowning, Margaret bears, at the age of 47, still another Samuel, whom she must take to another town to christen. So frightened are the people at this point of Margaret's name choosing. One woman tells the narrator she was 47, I'm telling you, and she had a child, 47. Thunk on it, or 47 was for scandalous. The baby is born an idiot. Disturbed by his Fort Samuel's brain, the father kills the child and then himself. Without the father, Margaret is unable to conceive a fifth Samuel. This story, supposedly a legend of Miguel Island, is told from the point of view of a stranger to the island. As a detached observer, he is able to admire Margaret's strength and self determination. For the natives, however, Margaret is a threat, a witch like woman who is in touch with the devil and whose moribund fertility brings destruction. In Hamlet, the sexual corruption and lack of judgment that makes something rotten in the state of Denmark seem to emanate from a middle aged woman. Gertrude has a characteristic observable in other change of life women in literature, what her sons call an increase of appetite. Hamlet, furious with his mother, has remarried immediately after the death of his father, generalizes that fury, frailty, thy name is woman. Act 1, Scene 2, in the confrontation scene in Gertrude's bedroom, Act 3, Scene 4, Hamlet condemns his mother for not acting her age. You cannot call it love, for at your age the heyday in the blood is tame, it's humble, and waits upon the judgment. Here again, Hamlet makes a general statement about female nature from his own philosophical presupposition, then goes on to say that with such mutiny in a matron's bones, we can hardly expect virtue from youth. Gertrude's menopausal passion is responsible for the dissolution of the family and the collapse of the state. The majority of mutinous matrons in literature confine their destructiveness to the smaller unit. They suffer and complain, threatening their sons and daughters and husbands, and of course, themselves. For example, Alma, the doting white mother of Lillian Smith's novel Strange Fruit, finds it difficult to control either her children or herself during the menopause. Change of life makes you like that. She must not permit herself to go to pieces over something trivial. F. Scott Fitzgerald, so often in search of a simple explanation for his wife Zelda's misbehavior, found a perfect one in the menopause. Fitzgerald even asked Zelda's doctor to discuss the mother's menopausal imbalance with Scotty, their daughter. In John O'Hara's last movie, The Ewings, Ada's son and daughter-in-law speculate about the effects of the menopause on Ada's behavior. Edna has heard a lot of talk about menopause that she passes on to her husband. You stop menstruating and have these hot flashes, and I have heard that you lose all sexual desire. But on the other hand, I've heard that when it's over, your sexual desire is at as great as ever. Some women, Edna continues, get depressed or even suicidal. Kate Brown, the heroine of Doris Lessing's novel, The Summer Before the Dark, has, like Ada Ewing, some offspring terribly concerned about their mother's menopause. Kate's children start treating her in a humorous and indulgent manner, assuming that she's going through the change of life. They treat the mother like an invalid and her stray cats like medicine. One day, Kate overhears the children talking about the cat. Just a thing for the menopause, they say. In the case of Gertrude and Hamlet, the menace is the woman herself. In the domestic situations described by Lessing and O'Hara, however, the real menace seems to be the children, who attempt to define, as indeed Hamlet did with Gertrude, their mother's behavior. A number of fictional characters experience the menopause alone, without husbands or children. For Mrs. Stone of Tennessee Williams' The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone, and Mrs. Elliot of Angus Wilson's The Middle Age of Mrs. Elliot, the menopause coincides with widowhood. Mrs. Stone experiences three critical events in the same year: the abandonment of her career, the death of her husband, and that interval of woman's life when the ovarian cycle is cut off. At first, Mrs. Stone is depressed and unfocused. At the end of what Williams calls the moon of pause, however, she temporarily discovers a new life and new energy. Although Angus Wilson is less graphic about Meg Elliott's menopause, he nonetheless gives his 43-year-old heroine certain characteristics usually associated with that stage: a lack of purpose, a tendency toward headaches and crying spells, a feeling of barrenness, like an old virgin afraid of turning sour. The widow is on the brink of psychic disintegration until, aided by her brother, she works her way back into the world. For some women, the problems and anxieties of the climacteric are insurmountable. Hamlet's mother's wantonness leads to her destruction and to the deaths of her son, her lover, and quite a few others. Mrs. Stone, who becomes after the moon of pause a woman of passion, is eventually discarded by her young Italian lover. In the last scene of the novel, she throws her keys to a sinister gigolo who has been following her for months, thus openly inviting him to rob and perhaps murder her. Joanna Burton, rejected by Joe Christmas because he finds her old and useless, plans a suicide pact with him. Christmas, however, runs from the burning house after Miss Burton shoots herself. He is eventually lynched. At times, the menopause is associated with death by cancer. When she meets an acquaintance she doesn't want to see again, Mrs. Stone invents the story that she had her uterus removed, but that the cancer has spread. Telling the lie gives Karen Stone a feeling of liberation, of having arrived at the void. Her lie becomes the truth, of course, at the end of the novel. The cancer is a moral one. The final loss of dignity, the void, is sexual abandon and ultimately death. Molly Bloom, the aging wife in Joyce's Ulysses, is menstruating near the end of the novel. She notices that her periods have become irregular. Is there anything the matter with my insides, or have I something growing in me getting that thing like that every week? When was it last? With Monday? Yes, it's only about 3 weeks I ought to go to the doctor. That thing is her period. Come again after only 3 weeks. She worries that something is the matter with her insides, that there might be something growing in her. The worry is probably the fear of cancer. But the most unusual connection between the menopause and cancer appears in Thomas Mann's novel, The Black Swan. In that story, a middle aged mother, a woman of feeling, goes on a journey with her daughter, a woman of reason. The mother falls in love with the young guide who takes them on a tour of a damp cave. In her sexual excitement, the mother, Rosalie, begins to bleed. She rejoices that the cycle has reasserted itself, calling her new blood my visitation, this Easter of my womanhood. Instead, the blood signals cancer of the uterus. Women who threaten themselves or their families during the menopause often do so in response to the fear that they may lose their sexual desirability. A character in Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn regrets that she has had so few lovers now that the menopause is approaching, and soon all her womanness will be lost. In a poem called Two from Pro Femina, Carolyn Kizier taunts those women who invest everything in their looks. You can wait for the menopause and catch up on your reading. But nowhere is the disappearance of a woman's sex appeal at the menopause more brutally stated than in Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. If she were only 10 years younger, complains Carl to Henry, if she were only 10 years younger, I might overlook the streak of gray hair and even the brittle arms. But she's too old, you see. With a cut like that, every year counts now. She said she was turning 40. That means 50 or 60. It's like effing your own mother. You can't do it, it's impossible. In this passage, Miller captures, in livelier language to be sure, the brittle, saggy, unyielding female who Robert Wilson in Feminine Forever warns us we will someday become if we don't take estrogen. However, not all women in literature turn brittle or lose their sexual drive at the menopause, nor even their appeal to men. Molly Bloom, in her middle age, is still an Andalusian flower. After menopause, Mrs. Stone, no longer subject to the red tides, finds that with the danger of pregnancy gone, she is capable of desire and its possible gratification. She feels no physical deterioration following the menopause. On the contrary, now that her body was rising out of the tangled woods of the climacteric, she felt a great resurgence of physical well being. Unfortunately, the new energy leads her to the wrong man, a younger version of Henry Miller's friend Carl, a man who makes his living servicing women. It is the lover's rejection of her that causes Mrs. Stone's degeneration. Some of the women in fiction who pull through the change with renewed vigor do so without relating sexually to a man. Meg Elliott of Angus Wilson's novel recovers after being nursed by her homosexual brother. She recovers and eventually leaves him to become the personal secretary of a woman member of parliament. The heroine of May Sarton's novel, Mrs. Stevens hears the mermaids singing experiences, nothing that Miss Sarton calls the menopause. But at the age of 45, Mrs. Stevens finds a new muse, Dorothea, and from this relationship, Mrs. Stevens creates new art. Ada Ewing, the main character of O'Hara's The Ewings, discovers sexual rebirth and a new life at the age of 52. She masturbates for the first time and enjoys it. She also has an affair with a younger woman, but eventually leaves town and goes to the West Coast to live with a woman her own age, leaving behind the son and daughter in law who had been so concerned that she would be suicidal or depressed during the menopause. But the two best known symbols in literature for menopausal renewal have been with us longer than Ada Ewing or Molly Bloom. One is Penelope, the character from the Odyssey on whom Molly is modeled. Penelope, who waits faithfully for her husband while he fights wars and seduces goddesses, grows old in his absence. When she and Odysseus are reunited, Penelope describes her suffering. Think what difficulty the gods gave. They denied us life together in our prime and flowering years, kept us from crossing into age together. In the reunion, nonetheless, the gods are kind. For Athena makes both husband and wife younger, more attractive, more desirable than either had been during the separation. Both they and Ithaca are restored. Chaucer's wife of Bath is a more realistic and less monogamous menopausal model than Penelope. In the course of her very active life, the sensuous wife wears out five husbands, thus reversing the stereotype of the aging male who runs through a series of young mates. The wife of Bath's tale also has menopausal implications. In that story, a young knight is forced to marry the old hag who saves his life by telling him what women want, mastery over men. On their wedding night, the hero is miserable. He is unable to kiss his wife because she is so foul, so loathly, and so old, so ill bred. After a long lecture, the aged wife asks him to choose between a wife who is foul and old, but humble, and a wife who is young and fair, but apt to entertain visitors. The knight, in keeping with the spirit of the story, turns the choice over to his wife. Now that she has mastery, she changes into a beautiful and young but faithful wife. In the world of epics and folk tales, menopausal women such as Penelope and the old hag are magically transformed into young women. In real life, there are no such options. Estrogen, the magical substance of our own scientific age, has some of the power of Athena's potion, but estrogen will not take away the wrinkles already there, nor straighten bend backs. The 20th century Penelope, Molly Bloom, had neither magic nor synthetic hormones to halt the aging process. Molly's solution was to keep on living, to affirm the power of her womanhood. In her soliloquy, the dominant word is yes. I love flowers. I love to have the whole place swimming in roses. Yes, he said I was a flower of the mountain. Yes, so we are flowers all. A woman's body. Yes, that was one true thing he said in his life. And the sun shines for you today. Yes, that was why I like him, because he saw, he understood, or felt what a woman is. And first I put my arms around him. Yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breast all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Molly's monologue occurs while she is menstruating. Although worried about her irregularity and afraid that she should see a doctor, Molly still affirms the flowering and bleeding of her body, aware as she does so of the inevitable wilting. Like the wife of Boz, she has mastery over herself. Afterward to part 5, the menopause. The menopause remains, particularly in literature, the most neglected phase of the menstrual cycle. Novelists, poets, and anthropologists are far more curious about puberty rites than about midlife passage. In most cultures, the November of the body goes by quietly, without ceremony. Although significant research has been done in the psychological and medical investigation of the menopause, the general concerns are what they were in 1976, with women still being prey to the uncertainties of hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, and to promises of eternal youth. Recent medical studies tend to address the three. Sorry. Okay. Recent medical studies tend to address the three physiological symptoms of menopause, which relate to estrogen fluctuation, hot flashes, vaginal dryness, and changes in menstrual flow. Many of these studies raise the issue of estrogen and cancer. A 1982 investigation by R. Don Gambrell Jr. applauded estrogen for preventing bone loss and heart disease, but concluded that unopposed estrogen therapy increases the risk of endometrial cancer. A 1982 investigation by R. Don Gambrell concluded that unopposed estrogen therapy increases the risk of endometrial cancer, a risk with which Gambrell claimed to be, however, greatly overestimated. In the same year, Barbara Holka found the risk of breast cancer to be greater for short term rather than long term use, and 4 times greater with injectable rather than oral products. Recently, the name Dr. Gambrell was quoted as saying that a combined estrogen progestin treatment actually decreases the risk of breast cancer. These investigations by Gambrell, Hoka, Carr, Jensen, and others represent the efforts of medical researchers over the past decade to document the advantages and disadvantages of hormone replacement. Estimates from 1986 indicate that 4 million women in America are taking some form of estrogen replacement therapy. Yet, as we write, the medical community has still to produce conclusions definitive enough to dispel our earlier skepticism. Voiced 1 year before the FDA warned about possible cancer risk for women using estrogen replacement. One of the most sensitive of the recent articles on drugs and the menopause was written by Kathleen I. McPherson, an associate professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Maine. McPherson is so concerned about distortions surrounding the menopause that she attacks the medical, political, and economic establishment for having transformed a natural process into a disease. McPherson, an activist nurse, deplores the intervention of drug companies, Searle, Upjohn, and Ayers Laboratories in the promotion of Robert Wilson's feminine forever theory. Ayers Laboratories actually funded a so-called information center on the mature woman without telling the public where the money was coming from. Until 1976 and the cancer warnings, Ayers' slogan was "Keep her on Premarin." Better news about estrogen comes from Pennywise Rudolph, MD, who in 1983 published a medical bestseller called No More Hot Flashes and Other Good News. Rudolph, who has been administering a combined dosage of estrogen and progesterone to her patients since the mid 1970s, claims that since both estrogen and progesterone are depleted during the menopause, then both should be replaced to maintain hormonal balance. Hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, spreads other good menopausal news: no more vaginal dryness, no more postmenopausal blues, no greater risk of breast cancer. Budoff, whose therapy has received wide medical approval, nonetheless cautions that certain women should not use HRT, especially women with suspected breast cancer or blood clotting. She also insists that research into hormonal matters continue and that such research be taken seriously by the medical profession. For as we know from past experience, the bad news too often follows, delayed sometimes for years as people in laboratories document the effects of diethyl stilbestrol, clonidine, tampons, the pill, the IUD, nicotine, estanol, aerobics, and aspirin on the female body. One innovative form of estrogen replacement is the skin patch, developed by Seva Pharmaceutical Company and approved in the fall of 1986 by the Federal Food and Drug Administration. The patch is placed on the abdomen and should be changed 2 times a week. According to reports, it delivers low dosages of estrogen directly into the bloodstream and offers fewer complications than estrogen pills, which must be metabolized by the liver. However, doctors testing the patch caution that women using this method of estrogen replacement, like those women taking estrogen orally, must combine estrogen with progestin and have regular checkups and endometrial biopsies. The Boston Women's Health Collective has been, almost from the inception of the new women's movement, articulating the doubts and concerns of women at large. In their updated New Our Bodies, Ourselves, they are fairly negative about hormone therapy, offering in its place certain non medical approaches to the problems surrounding the menopause. Among these are vitamins, especially C, D, and E, diet, herbal teas, meditation, acupuncture, sex, and exercise. Sex and exercise are getting considerable attention as remedies for the midlife crises. In a special over 40 issue of Harper's Bazaar, Dr. Morton Walker claims that sex, either intercourse or masturbation, can provide relief by keeping vaginal tissues toned and moist and releasing endorphins, the body's pleasure chemicals. An editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association tells where to send for a battery operated machine, which will improve vaginal muscle tone during the menopause. For midlife exercise without batteries, one might consult Jane Fonda. Her Women Coming of Age offers a sensible approach to the process of aging from the point of view of a woman who has thought about it and is going there. Like the New Our Bodies, Ourselves, Women Coming of Age, is skeptical of estrogen replacement therapy. Fonda urges that women in serious need of estrogen combine it with progestin and that women keep informed on medical findings about hormone replacement. Fonda's program emphasizes the prime time workout, an exercise plan designed for midlife problem areas, the back, the joints, the muscles. Such basic design Such basic diet exercise ideas are becoming more and more common in popular magazines. An example being Carol Kahn's The Total Anti-Aging Plan, whose title is an unfortunate rejecting of a life process rather than an intelligent accepting of it. Still, the content of Kahn's program helps to neutralize the cosmetic answer promoted in these same supermarket publications: facelifts, tummy tucks, mega moisturizers, wrinkle concealer wands. Reduction in estrogen levels has also been linked with another unidentified symptom of midlife, namely menopausal depression. It is telling that Pennywise Budoff, who speaks so confidently of HRT as a treatment for hot flashes and bone deterioration, is far less emphatic when she discusses postmenopausal blues. Budoff does not recommend hormones as a cure all for midlife depression. She does believe such treatment useful in cases where women in generally good mental health throughout their lives develop signs of depression in the mid 40s. She also feels that HRT is a safer remedy than the tranquilizers and antidepressants so frequently prescribed at the menopause. On the other hand, in a survey of recent British findings, Madeline Osborne concludes that there is no clearly proven association between estrogen and menopausal depression. The result of treatment trials with estrogen have on the whole been disappointing. It seems wisest to treat the depressed menopausal patients with methods that are appropriate to depression at any other time of life. Researchers appear to be turning more and more toward cultural explanations for menopausal depression. Investigations by Malka Notman, Paula Weidiger, Kathleen McPherson, Arne Holt, and others suggest that the negative symptoms associated with the menopause have less to do with hormonal change than with other coinciding midlife crises. Children leaving, the death of a parent, economic problems, divorce, job dissatisfaction, sexual dissatisfaction, and so forth. Psychiatrist Maggie Scarf, in fact, suggests that a special form of female depression precipitated by the hormone changes accompanying ovarian reproductive system decline actually doesn't exist at all. The symbolic importance of the menopause might in fact bear greater weight than the occasional physiological or psychological disturbances. Throughout our Throughout our menstrual lives, we may have felt depressed, been unable to sleep, or noticed wrinkles under the eyes, but the actual changing of the cycle, the expectation that soon there will be no blood, brings into focus other common signs of aging labeled menopause that we had simply been ignoring. In our search for literature about the menopause, we have unearthed very little fiction, new or old, to add to our survey. The program Golden Girls keeps the topic alive on television, but novels, from what we have seen, depict middle aged women without their menopausal fears. In her work on Black women writers, however, Mary Jane has discovered two crucial references to the menopause in the novels of Zora Neale Hurston. In Their Eyes Were Catching in Their Eyes Were Watching God, 1937, the heroine Janie Crawford returns home to Eatonville, her homecoming ironically coinciding with her menopause. She then, like Demeter and other midlife fertility figures, plants seeds as if to continue the life cycle despite the fact that Janie herself had never borne fruit. In Hurston's last novel, Seraph on the Suwannee, 1948, the menopause is more directly and far less favorably treated. R.V. Meserve, the menopausal wife, is dependent and terrified as she goes through the change of life, identifying herself completely within the closed sphere of wife and mother. R.V. faces the early autumn of her womb with self-hatred. One is more likely to encounter the menopausal hag in works from independent women's presses. One such publication, Broomstick, is directed specifically to women over 40. The lead story in the September-October 1986 issue is a fantasy called The Change, about full moons, werewolves, and Hilda, a menopausal woman. Hilda's change is not typical. She becomes a werewolf. It started happening after my change. I suddenly felt more powerful. At first, I only felt hot flashes, but one night I was outside and the moon was full. I looked down and saw the fur on my arms and hands. I had changed. In poetry, dreams, and folklore, the moon, usually the empty moon, is associated with the change. When the moon in her continuous cycle vanishes from view, we have Mother Nature's closest parallel to the menopause. Nisa, the Kung woman in Marjorie's Shostak's anthrobiography, describes her midlife change as the moon leaving. 1 month I felt a little pain and then I menstruated. The next month I felt even more uncomfortable. After then, the moon left me and I didn't see any more periods. But the discomfort remains because when the moon doesn't come to you, it causes your insides to hurt. Distance from the Moon is the theme of a brittle poem by Virginia Terrace called At 59. The moon comes up. I don't rush to meet it. It goes down. I don't care. The moon isn't my sister. I have joined the old women who no longer cringe at her rising. I laugh at the traps. She sets others. My bones point to the stars. That's how I travel. Terrace, finished with the moon change, stands outside of the menstrual process, free to laugh at her trapped sisters, at the moon herself. The aloofness expressed in Act 59 shows a positive response to the empty moon syndrome with its promises of weeping and depression. In a special issue on aging published in late 1976, the feminist journal Women explored in depth the midlife passage of women. The essays, fiction, and poetry touched on many aspects of menopausal and postmenopausal life. A number of poems published in this issue deal with menopausal attitudes. Most of them offer positive solutions to the problems of change of life. In Mary Winfrey's At Menopause, the poet compares her body to a fruitless grapevine. Although the grapes are gone, the vine continues to grow strong and to give shelter. People shelter beneath me like birds, my roots in. More roots into the kind earth. Never has the earth been kinder. Like May Sarton's tree in She Shall Be Called Woman, quoted in chapter 18. So Winfrey Strong, sinewy grapevine, celebrates the endurance and vitality of the female body. The aging issue of women has a number of imaginative responses to the menopause, including one brutal poem in which a woman sees herself as a half chewed bone that someday will lie clean in the desert sun, having to nourish no one. Harriet Murphy's sense of having been eaten alive by others is indeed disturbing, especially if we interpret the resolution of the poem to signify death. However, the clean, discarded bone could also be a symbol of the menopause when nature is no longer making its insistent demands on woman's body. Like the empty moon, so the sun bleached bone is free from responsibility. The harshness in the above poem reflects the enormous anger which many women discovered in themselves during the 1970s as they began to question the roles they had long been accustomed to playing: housewife, daughter, mother. In Midpoint, the lead poem in the aging issue, Kathy Kozachenko uses the menopause as the cycle in which the anger ascends, erupts, and subsides. She stored up the anger for 25 years. Then she put it on the table like a casserole for dinner. I have stolen back my life, she said. I have taken possession of the rain and the sun and the grasses, she said. You are talking like a mad woman, he said. My hands are rocks, my teeth are bullets, she said. You are my wife, he said. My throat is an eagle, my breasts are two white hurricanes, she said. Stop, he said. Stop, or I shall call a doctor. My hair is a hornet's nest. My lips are thin snakes waiting for their victim. He cooked his own dinners after that. The doctors diagnosed it common change of life. She too diagnosed it change of life. And on leaving the hospital, she said to her woman friend, "My cheeks are the wings of a young virgin dove. Kiss them." The first metaphor of the poem emerges from the woman's domestic life. She serves her anger like a casserole. The images become progressively more violent as she identifies herself with rocks, bullets, hurricanes. The destructive Medusa from Greek myth, "My lips are thin snakes waiting for their victim." Her madness is diagnosed change of life, a cliche which Kozachenko uses ironically, in that indeed life has changed both for husband and for wife. He now cooks his own dinners. She has been transformed from eagle to dove, from crazy housewife to a woman identified woman. Midpoint represents an extreme response to the midlife crises and particularly to the unhappy marriage, which triggers her anger. Most menopausal women don't end up in hospitals, yet the heightened discourse between male and female in Kozachenko's poem gives breadth to feelings shared by many women in the mid 1970s and right now, feelings too dangerous to articulate. Breakups and breakdowns have long been associated with the end of the menstrual cycle. What Kozachenko, Teres, and other recent poets reveal is that the change of life can be an affirmation of our uniquely female experience and an opportunity for new directions. Part 6, Sideshow. Chapter 23, The Menstrual Hall of Fame. On a fancy Long Island beach, a young woman goes for a midnight swim. She is bitten in half by a shark. All that rolls ashore is her head on her shoulders. Later, it's suggested that she had her period, a thing attractive to sharks. This grisly incident is the trigger for the plot in Peter Benchley's 1974 novel Jaws. A similar real life event happened in the summer of 1967 in Glacier National Park, Montana. Two young women campers were mauled to death by a grizzly bear. It was later said that one of them had been menstruating and that the smell of blood had enticed the bear. Probably no famous queens or female leaders have been cut off in mid career by sharks or grizzly bears, but menstruation has sometimes changed the course of history. If Queen Elizabeth I had menstruated regularly, she might have married, might have had a child, and changed the future of the British monarchy. If the 17th century American reformer Anne Hutchinson had not been undergoing menopause at the critical time, she might have given birth to a child rather than the premature deformity that confirmed her enemies' belief that she was a witch. The biblical Salome allegedly suffered from menstrual cramps. Was her request for John the Baptist's head a desire for revenge against the non menstruators of the human race? A desire to see a man bleed? Joan of Arc, it is said, never menstruated at all. She was 20 when she was burned at the stake. The eccentric French historian Jules Michelet writes of Joan that in her the life of the spirit dominated, absorbed the lower life, and held in check its vulgar infirmities. She grew up to be a robust and handsome, but the physical curse of women never affected her. Although Michelet seems to regard the possibility of Jones menstruating with disgust, he was fascinated with his own wife's monthly bleedings and recorded them meticulously. Date and time of day they began, color and character of the discharge, his feelings, but rarely hers, about the flow. His observations may still be read today in his journal. For Joan of Arc, lack of periods may have been useful in battle. For Queen Mary I of England, 1516 through 1558, and her younger half sister, Elizabeth I, 1533 through 1603, their childlessness, probably due to syphilis inherited from their father, Henry VIII, created great dynastic problems. Queen Mary suffered all her life from ischemia, now called amenorrhea, or lack of periods. Without success, she tried all the medical remedies known to her era: bleeding, Manus Christi, literally the hand of Christ, an exotic mixture of powdered pearls, gold leaf, sugar, and rose water to be eaten in the morning with the yolk of an egg, and aqua composita, a compound of Gascoigne wine, infusion of ginger, galangale, which is another kind of ginger, chamomile, cinnamon, nutmeg, grains, cloves, and anise seed. Mary's barrenness, left uncured by the remedies, was a source of great unhappiness to her and a cause of the rift between her and her husband, King Philip II of Spain. Her nickname in history, bestowed because of her fierce persecutions of Protestants, is curiously ironic: Bloody Mary. The Roman Catholic Mary desperately wanted a child so that the throne would not pass to her Protestant half sister, Elizabeth. But Elizabeth, it turned out, was also childless. She was succeeded by James I, a cousin whose wife bore the necessary son. Elizabeth, known as the Virgin Queen, never married. It is frequently said that she did not want to share her throne with a man, but her periods were infrequent, and it may be that she assumed she was sterile and hence felt no need to legitimize her relationships with the male flatterers who always surrounded her. Or she may have indeed preferred chastity to the possibility of dying in childbirth, which was not uncommon in her era. Elizabeth became queen in 1558. By the following year, there were many rumors that she was sterile and that her frequent bleedings were intended to remedy her lack of periods. Her laundresses noted that she had very few monthly periods, and this fact became widely known. In addition to bleedings, Elizabeth also followed the direction of Lord Cecil, her chief advisor: use only foods and scents vouched for, avoid irritant skin poisons by checking carefully anything touching her bare body, keep doors closed where her laundresses and wardrobe women did their work. Elizabeth's regimen was apparently no more successful than Mary's. In 17th century America, it was not uncommon for a woman who behaved improperly, a shrew, a gossip, a religious questioner, to be considered a witch. This was the case of Anne Hutchinson, 1591 through 1643, of Massachusetts, who preached the doctrine of salvation through grace and argued that women should have a voice in church affairs. Because she was successful in medicine, or healing herbs, and midwifery, she acquired a ready following for her theological opinions. Mistress Hutchinson was placed on trial for these opinions in 1637. During this trial, she was pregnant and seriously ill, but she was not allowed to sit down until it was obvious that she could no longer stand. Her arch enemy, Governor John Winthrop, records unfeelingly that her countenance discovered some bodily infirmity. Because of her ill health, she was finally broken and unable to carry on her defense. As a result, she was excommunicated and banished from the colony. Menopausal pregnancy seems to have been the cause of Anne Hutchinson's medical troubles. She suffered from hot flashes and other symptoms. During her menopause, she aborted New England's first hydatidiform watery mole. Dr. John Clark, a physician and preacher, described this monstrous birth with grotesque precision. It was 27 lumps of man's seed without any alteration or mixture of anything from the woman, every one of them greatly confused. The lumps were knit together by strings, which Clark believed were the beginnings of veins and nerves, and which were snarled together. The lumps contained partly wind and partly water. 6 of them were as large as a man's fist, and one as large as 2 fists. The globes were round things, including in the lumps about the smallness of a small Indian bean, and like the pearl in a man's eye. The 2 lumps which differed from the rest were like the liver or congealed blood, and had no small globes in them as the rest had. This was taken as a further sign of her being a witch and did not help her case. Anne Hutchinson's troubles were probably increased by the psychological stresses of the trial. Queen Marie Antoinette, 1755 through 1793, anticipating the guillotine, developed traumatic menstrual bleeding several days before her execution. On that final day, she had wanted to wear a white dress, the color of royal mourning, but found her chemise stained with blood. The gendarme refused to let her out of his sight to change her clothes, so she crouched in the narrow space between the bed and the wall, with the kitchen maid standing between her and the gendarme to hide her nakedness. She was ashamed to leave her soiled linen for the prying eyes of those who would examine her cell after she was gone. So she stuffed her chemise into a crevice in the wall behind the stove. Her bleeding served as one of her final punishments. Emma Goldman, the feminist anarchist, 1869 to 1940, was known as Red Emma the Witch, but for her politics, not her periods. Her periods were, however, irregular and painful. Like Marie Antoinette, she bled as a result of psychological stress. When her family was being smuggled from Königsberg in 1881 to escape the pogroms, young Emma's period came early, due to the excitement of our departure. She writes in her autobiography, Living My Life. The family had to plunge through icy water, and Emma says, the sudden chill froze my blood. Then I felt a stinging sensation in my spine, abdomen, and legs, as if I were being pierced with hot irons. When they reached their destination, Emma was given hot tea, packed in hot bricks, and covered with a large feather bed. She was an invalid for weeks. Her spine remained weak for years afterward. As an adult, Emma found her periods were still painful and consulted a doctor who suggested an operation that would free her from menstrual pain, allow her to have full sexual pleasure, and enable her to have children. But consulting her political ideals, Emma finally decided to find an outlet for my mother need in the love of all children. The operation did not take place. Emma devoted her life to writing and political action. Other women writers have suffered from menstruation. The British poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, 1806 to 61, took opium for her cramps and may have become addicted. Olive Schreiner, the South African British novelist, suffered greatly from premenstrual tension that prevented her from working. She lamented that her friend Eleanor Marx, Carl's daughter, was the only person with whom she could discuss her trouble. The French novelist George Sand once mistook menstrual pains for a serious fever and later said apologetically to her husband, I was afraid that I might be threatened with a serious illness, but realize now that this indisposition coincided with the bad time of the month for me. It also coincided with her first adultery. For the British novelist Virginia Woolf, however, menstruation unleashed the flow of imagination. In her diary entry for February 18, 1928, she records that I had thought to write the quickest, most brilliant pages in Orlando yesterday. Not a drop came, all, forsooth, for the usual physical reasons which delivered themselves today. It is the oddest feeling, as if a finger stopped the flow of the ideas in the brain. It is unsealed, and the blood rushes all over the place. Menstruation, then, is not always an impediment to women. Although it may be an embarrassment or a source of pain, it may also be a liberation, as with Virginia Woolf and with Lizzie Borden, that legendary New England murderess. When her period coincided with an epileptic attack, she took an axe to her parents and left them both bloody, both dead. Lizzie had always been noted for peculiar spells that had all the symptoms of what now called epilepsy of the temporal lobe or psychomotor epilepsy. Popular opinion in Fall River, Massachusetts held that poor Lizzie was always sort of crazy. Her epileptic seizures came only during her menstrual period, and then only 3 or 4 times a year. The spells were brief, no more than an hour long, and ceased when Lizzie reached menopause. In the previous year, Lizzie had committed a daylight robbery of her own house during a menstrual epileptic seizure. She had her period on August 4th, 1892, the morning of the murders. This is a matter of fact record. Murder during an epileptic seizure is rare, and one cannot say that Lizzie killed her parents. Actually, her father and stepmother, because of her epilepsy, but all evidence indicates that she killed the stepmother at least during a seizure. She had wanted to kill her stepmother earlier the day before. She had tried to buy prussic acid, a form of cyanide, for the purpose, but the druggist refused to sell it to her. So she was forced to use an axe. Contrary to the folk rhyme, she gave her father only 20 whacks with the axe and her stepmother only 10. At her inquest and trial, Lizzie benefited from the confusion of blood. Was the blood on her skirt menstrual or matricidal patricidal? Menstruation was a delicate subject, especially when discussed in front of all male juries of that time. At the inquest, Lizzie was asked how a bloodstain could get on her skirt. She answered, "I have fleas." Still another euphemism for menstruation. The kind of spot she had could hardly be from her period, however. A female jury, Victoria Lincoln notes, would not have acquitted Lizzie, for women knew that over their heavy napkins, women wore ruffled drawers to the knee and short white petticoats under the underskirt. A whitish smear caused by a heavy period was quite possible. A smear clear edge spot so placed would have been widely improbable, even if it had come from the inside, not the outside of the garment. After she was acquitted of the murders, although everyone assumed she had committed them, Lizzie Borden was ostracized in Fall River, where she remained until her death. She is still, as far as we know, the only menstrual murderess. Afterward, we may have been the first, but also were not the last to chronicle the cramps and craziness that may have changed the world. The books that followed the curse were eager to continue the Hall of Fame genre, notably Norris and Sullivan's PMS, premenstrual syndrome. Now, with the experience of age and 12 more years of menstruating, we wonder why we were so eager to celebrate the Lizzie Bordens and other menstrual mad women instead of the millions of the rest of us who manage families and nations, corporations and classrooms, who face the empty page, the washing machine, the assembly line, the unsown field, and the unsown hymn, while we are premenstrually tense or bleeding through our tampons or doubled over with cramps. These should be the real members of a menstrual hall of fame, along with the hundreds of women all over the world who are doing scientific, medical, sociological, and psychological research into menstruation and its meaning and the quality of women's lives. You will find evidence of their work throughout this edition. Please consider the whole book a menstrual hall of fame. Chapter 24, Moving the Menses or Vicarious Menstruation. A woman does not have to bleed from the womb alone. The extremely rare phenomenon, vicarious menstruation, is a monthly bleeding from a mucous membrane other than the uterus. Most of the cases, 70%, are supplementary. That is, bleeding occurs along with the regular menstrual flow. The other 30% are substitutive. That is, bleeding occurs someplace other than the uterus, sometimes even after menopause. The most common place is the nose, the site of 30% of vicarious menstruation. Most women's nasal mucosa become red and swollen before their periods. This swelling, aptly named rhinorrhea, is a part of the menstrual syndrome. If unusual hormonal changes occur, the period may come in two places at once. Fortunately, the blood loss through vicarious menstruation is usually scanty. Vicarious menstruation has not been studied extensively. Physicians still cite a 1920 report by O.H. Roth, who examined 225 cases of vicarious menstruation reported between 1870 and 1920. Roth found that 30% of the cases of bleeding occurred in the nose, 18% in uterine ulcers, 8% each in the skin and in the lungs, 5% in the breast, and the rest in the stomach, mouth, pharynx, bladder, ears, eyes, larynx, and vagina. It should stick. It should be recalled that the menstrual fluid, although it passes through the vagina, does not originate there. The uterus, not the vagina, bleeds. Vicarious menstruation does have its human interest side. In 1882, J.T. Gordon reported the case of Mrs. H, who was 41 years old and weighed 254 pounds. She had profuse bleeding from her thumb. The bleeding had occurred simultaneously with her period for more than 3 years. The bleeding lasted 3 to 5 days. A bandage around it had to be changed frequently. When the spot was not bleeding, it could be recognized only by a slight blueness of the skin over an area not larger than a half pea. Mrs. H reported no pain from her thumb while it was bleeding and added that it rather feels good. It is tempting to regard the female stigmatics, those saints whose bodies bleed in different spots in imitation of Christ's wombs, as vicarious menstruators. However, the stigmata of three of the best known, Catherine de Ritchie, Marie de Morel, and Louise Leteau, appeared every Thursday noon through Friday afternoon, not monthly. Why do the vicarious menstruate where they do? Psychoanalyst Helen Douche claims that the choice of organ for vicarious menstruation is determined by the patient's psyche. There is little evidence to prove or disprove her, but there are medical reasons for the phenomenon. Most common is sensitivity of some tissues to a high level of estrogen in the blood, with the mucous membranes of the nose being most likely to be affected by it. The other possible source of vicarious menstruation is surgical error. Bits of the lining of the womb may be mistakenly implanted in the incision during cesarean sections, removal of fibroid tumors, or in episiotomy during childbirth. The lining of the womb will menstruate wherever it is. The unfortunate victims of medical mistakes or hormonal sensitivity can be helped. Vitamins K, C, and P will strengthen capillary walls. As the last resort, medical texts recommend castration, presumably hysterectomy. But for most women who suffer nothing more serious than a nosebleed, vicarious menstruation is a minor annoyance. Afterward, vicarious menstruation is treated vicariously elsewhere in this book. In the afterword to Woman Unclean, we observe this phenomenon in John Paul Meyer's 1984 play Agnes of God. Agnes bleeds from her hands in imitation of Christ's womb stigmata, but also in imitation of menstrual blood, which is a sign of Agnes's human sexuality. Dr. Brian De Palma makes excellent use of displaced or vicarious menstruation in a number of his films. In The Fury, 1979, the teenage heroine is capable of making people bleed from their hands and their nostrils, a gift clearly connected with the displacement of menstrual blood. And in De Palma's Body Double 1984, a menstruating actress bleeds from her breast. But the film which would surely win the Academy Award for vicarious menstruation is Carrie, 1976. Also directed by Brian De Palma and based on the 1974 novel by Stephen King, which we discussed in chapter 17. The opening scene occurs in a gym. When ignorant Carrie starts to bleed, her classmates throw tampons at her. This is Carrie's menarche, her first real menstruation. The menstrual theme is repeated throughout the film, climaxing at the moment when a bucket of pig's blood is dumped on Carrie from above the stage. The camera shows a blood-drenched Carrie who is bleeding everywhere from her hair, her lips, her arms, her shoulders, her feet. Brian has moved Carrie's menses from the shower to the stage, from her vagina to her entire body, so that she visually resembles a saturated tampon. Much of this scene is photographed with a red filter. Even the camera, it seems, is menstruating vicariously. Chapter 25, Escaping the Monthlies. No woman would menstruate if she did not have to, Germaine Greer said, and it is a rare woman indeed who hasn't at some time wished she didn't menstruate. Many a female has cursed the curse, but there is a very little she can do about it except wait for pregnancy or menopause. Medical texts list many causes for amenorrhea. Most are exotic, if not impossible to attain. Turner syndrome, for instance, is characterized by a lack of periods, but women born with this syndrome also have low set ears, a webbed neck, and a low intellect, and are unlikely to be more than 4 feet 8 inches in height. There is also the Stein Leventhal syndrome, characterized by loss of menstruation and fertility, ovaries that are oyster like in appearance, and abnormal growth of facial hair. For most women, menstruation is virtually inescapable, although there have been attempts to thwart it. In 1934, a Los Angeles physician named George Starr White published a peculiar book entitled The Emancipation of Women, or Regulating the Duration of the Menses. White felt that women's periods are unnatural, that the normal state is a natural mucus flow like that of animals. Moreover, the more naturally a woman lived, the shorter the duration of her menses, according to White. Finally, he discovered a process called naturalizing, invented by his family physician to stop the menstrual flow for circus performance. It consists of the doctors inserting a tampon under the uterus while pressing on a woman's abdomen. The next day, the doctor removes the tampon and replaces it. With this method, the flow usually does not last more than 2 or 3 days, regardless of previous bleeding. After 4 or 5 months, the average case becomes a 1 day woman. After a year, she may be in the 1 hour class. White claims that the treatment was successful in 15 case histories he provides and that it has added benefits. It eliminates pimples and rough skin. And the daughters and granddaughters and great granddaughters of women treated this way have no blood in their menstrual flow, which lasts only a few hours. The success of White's method seems unlikely, the inheritance of acquired characteristics impossible. Nevertheless, White was attempting to fulfill a need that standard medical science has still not answered. What indeed does a circus performer do if she has a heavy flow? There are several things she can do that will not work. In Catherine Ann Porter's Old Mortality, the girls suck on salt and lemon in order to stop their periods before going to a ball. Instead, they just make themselves sick. Warren's Household Physician 1901, a handbook commonly used around the turn of the century, strongly advises girls against dipping their feet in cold water to stop their periods. According to Warren, the most lovely and innocent girls have done this for the purpose of attending a party, and in some instances, the stoppage induced has ended in death within a few hours. Okay. In both of these instances, the girls want to halt their periods because of social events, not because their professional fulfillment might be impaired. Frivolous rather than serious reasons are given. Perhaps it is the same failure to take women seriously that has kept medicine from finding a way to end menstruation short of menopause. Nevertheless, there are several ways, none of them conducive to good health, in which menstruation can be ended. One is pathological dieting, the refusal to eat, called anorexia nervosa, which is fundamentally an emotional disturbance. The woman with this disease is usually bright, articulate, self disciplined, but with a horror of fat. She rarely eats more than token meals, may make herself vomit, and exercises compulsively. She will cease menstruating, but she may also starve to death if she is not given medical and psychological treatment. Other illnesses may also cause missed periods. One is tuberculosis. White warns his readers against folklore, the idea that the eradication of blood from the menstrual period will cause tuberculosis is rank superstition and based on no finding of fact. Instead, the reverse is true. Tuberculosis in advanced stages will cause the eradication of the menses. But as in the case of anorexia nervosa, loss of periods is a sign of loss of good health. Another illness that will end menstruation is heroin addiction. Addiction to opiates commonly causes infertility, lack of ovulation, and loss of menstruation, probably through the action of drugs on the hypothalamus, a part of the brain. In one study, 67% of women heroin addicts entering a methadone maintenance program menstruated infrequently, if at all. After they had been on methadone for 2 months, all but one resumed their regular periods. Poor nutrition is probably a factor in the missed periods, as it is with anorexia nervosa, because the women placed on methadone were also given better supervised diets. Women addicts who withdraw without methadone take longer to regain their cycles. Menstruation can be eliminated through good health, claim the followers of Dr. Shelton's School of Hygiene. The Sheltonians see menstruation itself as the illness, as did the 19th century gynecologist Dr. A.F.A. King. King's cure for the menstrual disease was continual pregnancies. Shelton's is proper care of the abdominal organs. As the common toad bloodlessly sheds its skin, as the bird bloodlessly sheds its feathers, so a truly healthy woman can shed her membranes without bleeding. One woman has written to us that she has followed Shelton's prescription of diet and exercise and that she no longer menstruates. Menstruation may also be ended by the atomic bomb. One of the effects of radiation sickness, as it appeared after the bombing of Hiroshima, was the cessation of menstruation. John Hersey writes in Hiroshima, and as if nature were protecting man against his own ingenuity, the reproductive processes were affected for a time. Men became sterile, women had miscarriages, menstruation stopped. There remains the possibility of hysterectomy, the surgical method of ending menstruation. In a complete hysterectomy, the uterus is removed. The removal of the ovaries is called an ovarectomy. With no uterus, there is no lining of the uterus, hence no menstruation. Although many American doctors, as we have noted, are eager to perform hysterectomies, perhaps they should be called remunerectomies, so profitable are they for the practitioners. The operation is a serious and expensive one and does not increase woman's control over her own body. She may also begin aging prematurely. It is not a practical solution to the bother of menstruation. Undoubtedly, the least unsafe suppressor of menstruation is the hormone. Hormones have been given the paraplegic and severely handicapped women and to women in plaster cast in order to stop their monthly bleeding until they are in better condition. The birth control pill and similar products can stop menstruation indefinitely if taken continually. Prostitutes, as we have seen, use them for this purpose, but long-range side effects are unknown. It is apparent that most cures for menstruation are worse than the curse. No one would prefer tuberculosis, heroin addiction, or the deadly embrace of an atomic bomb. But Menstrual extraction may open a new era in women's history, an age of real control over our bodies, over the menstrual process. Menstrual extraction was developed by women for women, a group of feminists in Los Angeles at the self-help clinic of the Feminist Women's Health Center were troubled by menstruation and decided to end it. Lorraine Rotham, Carol Downer, and other women developed the technique, a very simple one. In menstrual extraction, a woman or one of her friends may end her period almost as soon as it starts. When her bleeding begins or when her period is due, if she is late, she or her friend inserts into her uterus a tube called a cannula, about 1/10 of an inch in diameter. This tube is attached to a collection bottle and to a syringe about 6 inches long that literally pumps out the period. The built up lining of the womb, which is sloughed off naturally over several days of menstruation, is pumped away in minutes. Enthusiasts claim a 60-second period. Menstrual extraction is not a backroom procedure. In November 1973, the feminists of Los Angeles presented a menstrual extraction review for the American Public Health Association conference. The self-help clinic performed a menstrual extraction for the women in the audience. The males, 10 in an audience of over 70 people, were asked to leave and did so reluctantly. The response from the women was widely enthusiastic, and the historic event was recorded on videotape. Two of the most unusual practitioners of menstrual extraction are Lolly and Jean Hirsch, a mother and daughter team who also published the monthly Extract, an irregular periodical. Traveling mostly on the East Coast, they appear before women's groups, showing women how to examine their genitals and demonstrating menstrual extraction on each other. Disgusting. For the Hirsches and for the rest of us, menstrual extraction is revolutionary. It is cheap, quick, simple. It eliminates belts, pads, pins, plugs, and pains except for possible cramping during extraction. It gives a woman complete control of her body, for if she is pregnant, the process serves as a mini abortion. Okay, another term used for the procedure, and there's the rub or one of them. That's completely weird. Today, menstrual extraction is embroiled in controversy. There are those who question its safety. Will it cause infection, which might lead to pain, fever, and possibly hospitalization and a D&C? Is it true that the female organs are more prone to infection during menstruation than at any other time in a woman's cycle? But physicians disagree about the likelihood of uterine infections. Does menstrual extraction always work? No one can be certain. There are legal questions. Is it abortion? If it is, the state and the medical profession would like to control it. Similarly, is it practicing medicine without a license? Again, the medical profession steps in. Currently, there are no certain answers to these questions. The health establishment has involved itself directly in the process, calling it menstrual regulation. Doctors used it experimentally on the raped women of Bangladesh, nor is the profit motive far behind. As early as 1971, Upjohn considered manufacturing a do it yourself extraction kit in time for Christmas gift giving. Menstrual extraction has become a political as well as a health issue. The safety factor is ignored when profit and population control are possible. Men, especially one Harvey Carmen of Los Angeles, have claimed that they invented the procedure and should control it. When Ellen Frankfurt first described the extraction process in the Village Voice in 1971, she received dozens of letters of protest from doctors about its supposed dangers. But, says Frankfurt, the doctors were more upset at the independence, that period extraction in particular, and self help in general gave women rather than at the dangers of either. Few argued or even considered that the device could be made safer. None remembered that the first camera or radio or airplane was not perfect, and that only in time could a new invention be judged. Menstrual extraction is by far the most exciting discovery of the women's health movement. At the same time, the extraction controversy bears watching because it illustrates contemporary menstrual politics at work. Will we be able to keep our newfound control over our own bodies, or will we once again have to submit to men's definitions of our needs? Afterward, today, menstrual extraction is still considered an extra legal procedure to be performed among women in advanced self help groups. No way has it become a mainstream alternative to the pains and pleasures of the more traditional ways of handling the monthly cycle. Some of the techniques of menstrual extraction have been incorporated into the vacuum aspiration abortion techniques performed in very early pregnancies, helping to make these the safest and least disruptive of all abortions. But the political realities of abortion itself continue to inhibit the further dissemination of menstrual extraction information among women and the study of both the immediate and long-term effects of repeated artificial evacuation of the contents of the uterus. Lorraine Rothman of the Los Angeles Federation of Feminist Women's Health Centers told us that no one can do studies on menstrual extraction and determine its safety as long as it exists outside the law. She noted that extraction is rarely used in states or municipalities where abortion is readily available, but that the ultimate control for women would be to be able to use the techniques for whatever reason they choose, be it relief of cramps or termination of pregnancy. Beryl Benderly, on the other hand, in thinking about abortion, confronts menstrual extraction strictly as an end run around abortion, noting that it exposes women who are not pregnant to the risk of surgery if performed on a woman whose period is late without testing for pregnancy. Menstrual extraction obscures the real reason for the period's delay, possibly preventing the woman from getting the medical attention she needs. Whether women want to use menstrual extraction as an alternative to abortion or as a way of escaping the mess of menstruation, it is important to remember its origins in the self help movement, which has worked to give women knowledge, power, and ultimately control over their bodies. A single menstrual extraction is always performed by at least three women in the company of a group who meet regularly for the purpose, who are experienced with the techniques and who are familiar with the physiological changes brought about by each other's menstrual cycles. Laura Punnett calls it a form of woman controlled medical research and reminds us not to confuse it with menstrual regulation, a procedure performed by physicians and used around the world as a form of population control. Part 7, Men. Chapter 26, Signade, Simulated Menstruation in the Male. Not content to surround menstruation with images of filth and fear, man has tried for at least a few eons to learn how to do it himself. From time to time, men have participated either physically or intellectually in the kobod, the imagined motherhood of the male from cover to hatch. In certain societies, men imitate their wives as they give birth, suffer the pains, and receive all the attention when it's over. Analogies to Kobad abound in Western literature and myth. In Hemingway's story, Indian Camp, the Indian husband is so upset by his wife's pain in giving birth that he slits his own throat. In the medieval French romance, Aucassin et Nicolette, Aucassin gives birth, but he is beaten for doing so. Even some of the Greek gods are born without mothers. Athena from Zeus's forehead, Dionysus from his thigh, Aphrodite from Cronus's testicles thrown into the sea. All these seem to represent a male refusal to allow the birth giving function to be solely female. The men want to share in and to define the acts themselves. Mary Eldon points out the subtle kobod in Malamud's The Fixer. The heroism is that of a spiritual pregnancy. Yaakov Bach, we are steadily told, does not seek out or demand his ordeal. He receives it. The virtues of Bach are those of the pregnant woman: endurance, patience, the gradual growth and focusing of purpose. The end of the book is the incipient delivery. Bach is on his way to some kind of birth. Okay, so it looks like I got cut off. So I'm just going to end it here and go and grab a bite to eat and come back. So stay tuned with me. We're still on chapter 26, Cyanide, the simulated menstruation in the male. I'm just going to start that chapter over and finish from there. So stay tuned. Be back in a sec. Okay, so I'm back. Chapter 26, Synod, Simulated Menstruation in the Male. So, not content to surround menstruation with images of filth and fear, man has tried for at least a few eons to learn how to do it himself. From time to time, men have participated either physically or intellectually in the kovod, the imagined motherhood of the male, from kover to hatch. In certain societies, men initiate their wives as they give birth, suffer the pains, and receive all the attention when it's over. Analogies to Kobad abound in Western literature and myth. In Hemingway's story, Indian Camp, the Indian husband is so upset by his wife's pain in giving birth that he slits his own throat. In the medieval French romance, Aucassin et Nicolette, Aucassin gives birth, but he is beaten for doing so. Even some of the Greek gods are born without mothers. Athena from Zeus's forehead, Dionysus from his thigh, Aphrodite from Cronus's testicles thrown into the sea. All these seem to represent a male refusal to allow the birth-giving function to be solely female. The men want to share in and to define the act themselves. Mary Ellman points out the subtle kobod in Malamud's The Fixer. The heroism is that of a spiritual pregnancy. Yaakov Bach, we are steadily told, does not seek out or demand his ordeal, he receives it. The virtues of Bach are those of the pregnant woman: endurance, patience, the gradual growth and focusing of purpose. The end of the book is the incipient delivery. Bach is on his way to some kind of birth. The fixer also contains, in effect, the imagined menstruation of the male. There is no term for that. Perhaps Signod would be analogous to Kovad, from Sagner, to bleed. Many primitive societies impose on their young men a puberty rite that causes them to bleed from the genitals. The boys are therefore able to mark their initiation into adulthood with a dramatic physical sign that can be equated with the monarch of the girls. More advanced civilizations have abandoned such rites, but they incorporate in their literature allusions to the male's desire to imitate, control, or assimilate the female functions within his own body to compensate for the lack of a womb and a vagina. Classic interpretations of male puberty rites, such as circumcision, the cutting of the foreskin from the penis, and subincision, slitting the underside of the penis along the urethra, producing a permanent disfigurement of the form and function of the penis, do not include envy. They rely on the psychoanalytic interpretation that circumcision is a symbolic castration of sons by fathers, and on the anthropological view that circumcision was a rite of initiation into adult society. Red, the first anthropologist to study these rites in depth, went a little further. He believed that the male mutilations expressed a rigid sexuality solidarity among the men and the essential opposition of the community of male interest to the quote unquote sphere of women. Reed's views satisfied most students of this field until some began to probe more deeply into the causes of this supposed antagonism between men and women. Bruno Bettelheim in 1954 was the first to look beyond castration anxiety and male superiority as causes of the bloody initiation rites and to offer instead the premise that one sex feels envy in regard to the sexual organs and functions of the other. He was not talking about penis envy, which originates, according to Freud, when a little girl, seeing a boy's penis for the first time, immediately assumes that it must be better for masturbation than her own minuscule clitoris and wants one for herself. Her quest for a penis will never be completely satisfied, but she will find contentment if she will accept her mother role and the child in the womb as the next best thing to a penis. There are today many reasons to question this theory, especially in the light of long established anthropological evidence of Kovad, but Freud's work is so important to the understanding of the human psyche that even his most tenuous theories have been swept along to respectability in the tidal wave of his influence. Bettelheim's premise, on the other hand, is that men envy women their ability to bear children. Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, explains. The fear of woman and the mystery of her motherhood have been for the male no less impressive imprinting forces than the fears of the mysteries of the world of nature itself. And there may be found in the mythologies and ritual traditions of our entire species innumerable instances of the unrelenting efforts of the male to relate himself effectively in the way, so to say, of an antagonistic cooperation to these two alien yet intimately constraining forces, woman and the world. By the world, Campbell means such things as the change of seasons, the rhythms of the moon and the tides, processes that even the most primitive human link in the great chain of being could recognize as being analogous to the lives of women. The 28-day lunar cycle, on which he believed the menstrual cycle was dependent, the growth, ripening, and fall of the fruit from the trees, so like the bursting fecundity of women. To maintain a dominance over mysterious bleeding woman, man had to assimilate woman's functions within himself, to bleed from the genitals, to give birth, and to assume a ritual maternity in order to fool the goddess of nature into accepting him as the dominant sex. The most widespread male puberty rite among all the pre-literate peoples of the earth is circumcision. So important is the cutting of the foreskin that it is still widely practiced today on infant boys as a hygiene measure. Elizabeth Gold Davis theorizes that the practice originated in the mythical days when a mountain of foreskins was showered on the great goddess in tribute and at the insistence of the ruling women. Yet, women were not even mentioned when circumcision became the sign of the covenant between the Hebrew patriarchal God and his chosen people. Bettelheim, by linking circumcision rites with the ancient fertility rites rather than with simple rites of passage, advances the convincing hypothesis that genital mutilation is a direct attempt by the male to overcome the problem of woman's ascendancy in procreation. He stresses the importance in primitive societies of bestowing the severed foreskin on one's mother, sister, or another female who will then wear it, honor it, cook it, and then eat it. In return, the male expects to receive symbolically that female's power of maternity. For example, certain rituals of circumcision emphasize that by shedding genital blood, the boy will assume the powers of menstruation and childbearing possessed by the mythical women of the creation stories. In Australian myth, circumcision is said to originate with a semi human bird, Juria. The bird throws a boomerang that on its return, circumcises the bird and cuts the vulvas of its wives, causing the first menstruation. The extreme secrecy of boys' puberty rites, Bettelheim believes, is closer than any other tribal phenomenon to the secrecy among the women surrounding the act of childbirth. He suggests that the men exclude women from any knowledge of their secret rites in retaliation for women's refusal to share the mysteries of childbirth. Men of one Australian tribe go to such lengths to enforce a ritual solidarity that they attempt to convince their women that they do not defecate. Boys' rectums are stopped up temporarily as part of the puberty rite. Disgusting. But the women are led to believe that the blockage is permanent. If a man becomes incapacitated through illness, his wife is told by the others that the illness is responsible for the rupture of the seal of puberty. The image of men constantly hiding their feces from the women suggests vividly the image of women hiding their menstrual rags from the eyes of men, both believing they are preserving the integrity of their own sex and its secrets. We give prolonged attention to Bettelheim's theories here because they seem in accord with the belief that fear of woman's procreative powers is one of the most profound of human imprints. Although classic anthropological explanations for the origin of circumcision claim that it is a hygienic practice, a preparation for sex life, a test of endurance, a tribal mark, a sacrifice to the goddess of fertility, or a sanctification of the generative faculties. Such explanations tend to overlook that in causing himself to bleed from his genitals, man is pretending to menstruate. He is thereby recreating in himself the role that biology has assigned exclusively to women. What actually happens at adolescent circumcision is at least as important as the ceremony's sociological implications. The rites of sub-incision, practiced almost exclusively in Australia, intensify this belief. It follows circumcision in the sequence of the initiation rites. Unlike circumcision, which can occur only once, sub-incision frequently takes place 2 or 3 times as a further assimilation of female power in the maturing male. In an extreme case, the tribesmen of the Wogeo Islands of New Guinea periodically incise the penis and allow blood to flow to rid themselves of the impurities of sexual intercourse, of which women are naturally cleansed by menstruation. Ashley Montague is one who believes that subincision is simulated menstruation based on the bloodletting common to both and the feminization of the appearance of the penis that results. Men who have been subincised are forced to urinate in a squatting position like women. Even more convincingly, Gesa Roheim notes that the subincised penis is called vagina in the sacred songs. Blood squirting from the penis is described by words that mean women or milk. And during the ritual in one tribe, the subject runs backward in a creek, flicking up his penis to show the womb. The words of vagina and creek are used interchangeably. Some tribes are parallel some tribes use parallel names for menstrual blood and blood from the incision wound. More evidence of the womb envy in boys' initiation rites is revealed when boys' rites are compared with girls'. A girl's initiation normally follows the first appearance of her menstrual blood. The flowing of the blood is the significant event. What happens at the rites merely commemorates nature's decision. The timing of the first menstruation is beyond the control of the girls or their elders. The aerial spirits or supernatural snakes that bring on the monarch do not invade several pubescent vaginas at once. Consequently, most of the societies studied tend to conduct separate initiation rites for each girl who reaches her monarch. Although in some places girls who have already been initiated may take part in a new girl's ceremony. Because there is no spontaneous biological event that heralds adulthood in a boy, boys of an appropriate age are usually initiated in groups. In these group rites, the all important fertility aspect of the ceremony gets submerged in the appearances of induction into the tribe. Perhaps this is one reason why the imitative character of such rites has so long been overlooked. It has been too easy to make the obvious connection between puberty rites in primitive societies and the initiation rites of fraternal organizations of all types, which have been popular for centuries throughout the Western world. Yet, even in those fraternal rites, there must be a suggestion of men imitating women, of men getting together to share trivial or ritual secrets with one another because they are perpetually excluded from the greatest secret of all. A dramatic example of the male attempt to control menstruation by assimilating it to himself is given by the French historian Jules Michelet. He avidly recorded the details of the menstruation of his young wife, Ath- Athenias Mialaret, whom he married when he was 51 and she was 23. Michelet was fascinated with blood and with woman. He defines historical characters by the quality of their blood. For example, the thin blood of Robespierre is opposed to the carmine and generous blood of the people. Woman is the incarnation of nature. Like nature, she is ruled by rhythms. Woman represents grace and emotion, man, law, and intellect. Michelet is interested in woman as a spectacle and watching, not to possess her, but to uncover her. Hence, although Michelet reports that his wife was frigid and rarely allowed sexual consummation, he adored watching her, especially when she was menstruating. He studied her intestinal life in order to shed light on the vaginal. Apparently, she complied with his study, even with his whims on one occasion. He sat below her while she added a few drops to the sea. Michelet wanted to serve as his wife's home femme de chambre, serving all the functions of a maid and friend. He had opportunity, for she was frequently ill. He wanted to be her mentor, supervising her studies of insects. He taught her also to watch. He liked to think of the sexes being assimilated to one another. He wrote a fantasy about a couple who constantly impregnated each other. He said his wife impregnated him with her perfume. Beginning in 1857 and lasting through 1860, Michelet's journal contains much about sex and especially about menstruation. From Michelet, one can chart his wife's menstrual cycles. In 1857, Les Régles arrived June 30th, then July 30th. He remarks that the second period was 5 days late, as in this case, he usually anticipates a 25-day cycle, although his wife's ranges from 25 to 30 days. He becomes upset at deviations from the cycle, but sometimes he makes obvious counting mistakes. Usually, he gives the time of day that her period arrives. Sometimes he describes the color. He does not, however, criticize superstitions surrounding her periods. Apparently, she was not to bathe during them, for he says at one point that she took a bath too soon afterward. He sees nothing odd in her washing her own kimmies so that the laundress will not know of her menstruation, although it sounds to a modern reader like an avoidance taboo. Probably some superstition is behind his surprise that she has a bloody nose during her period. Why is Michelet so fascinated by menstruation? As a historian, Michelet wants to record and, by recording, have a sense of mastery. He wants to subsume his wife in himself, assimilating both male and female. Menstruation is Michelet's journals can be read as a symbol of his desire to consume woman, especially those of her processes most closely connected with the rhythms of nature. In this, he is clearly not alone. Chapter 27, Cycles and Rhythm in Men. When Shakespeare has his Julius Caesar proclaim, I am constant as the northern star, the bard may have been making use of the usual stereotypes. Women are flighty, men firm. Females are emotional, males are reasonable. Women have cycles, men don't. Julius Caesar or Shakespeare was wrong. Although most men do not bleed from their genitals every month as women do, men's behavior does follow distinct cycles. Even epilepsy, Julius Caesar's falling sickness, may be cyclical. And unlike women's periodic bleedings, raging hormonal imbalances in men may be all the more dangerous because they are less predictable. Both sexes are subject to circadian or 24-hour cycles, a flux in hormones, moods, strengths, and weaknesses. Those lucky persons whose body times are synchronized with their work hours will find that their temperatures rise in the morning, giving them a greater push to get up and go. Their temperatures will drop in the evening. Circadian rhythms are difficult to alter. Night shift workers are more likely to have nervous disorders or ulcers. The phenomenon of jet lag, which strikes the traveler who flies overnight to Peking, is widespread. Often mental efficiency will be affected by it. Most males are conditioned to see themselves as overcoming such rhythms, such external forces. Their manhood may be dependent on such a self image. But a chink in the armor appeared in the 1974 perjury case of California Lieutenant Governor Ed Reinick. One of Reinick's defenses was that because of a jet lag after a trip from California to Washington, D.C., he may not have known what he was saying. Monthly rhythms are perhaps inevitably more difficult for men to face because we are all taught that only females suffer from periodic craziness. But as early as 1897, it was noted that both sexes bleed periodically with lung hemorrhages, hemorrhoids, and hyperemia of the liver. A research study in 1933 observed monthly epilepsy attacks in the stronger sex. The male menstrual, the word means monthly. Cycle does not confine itself to diseases. Dr. Rex Hersey of the University of Pennsylvania studied factory workers in 1929 and 1930. He chose to observe average and well-adjusted workers and managers, those who seemed quote unquote normal in overt respects. For a year, he interviewed each man 4 times a day, made regular physical examinations, and interviewed the men's families. He arrived finally at charts for each individual showing that emotional variations were predictable not only in 24-hour circadian cycles, but also in a near monthly rhythm, a cycle of 4 to 6 weeks. One 22-year-old man showed a 4.5 week cycle with variations no greater than those in a woman's menstrual cycle. During low periods, he was apathetic at home and at work. He temporarily abandoned his artwork. Another man with a 5 to 6 week cycle had manic periods during which he felt outgoing and confident with great vigor and energy. During his low periods, he found work a burden, needed more sleep, and preferred to sit quietly. In his manic periods, he slept less and even weighed less. One happy 60-year-old in the study claimed that he never changed. The I am as constant as the Northern Star syndrome. He, it turned out, had a 9 week cycle. His mood decline was so gradual that he did not realize he was criticizing his superiors, refusing to make jokes with his colleagues, and in general withdrawing. Yet, if he had accepted, as women must because of their bleeding, the role of cycles in his life, he would have had a much better understanding of himself. Flighty women are usually the butts of jokes about women drivers, but men drivers, it has been shown, have higher accident rates. Even the Auto Safety Committee of the Conservative American Medical Association concluded that women are better drivers because they're less emotional than men. Men drivers do indeed have their ups and downs, monthly ones. Estelle Rainey relates this incident in her Miss article on men's cycles. The Omi Railway Company of Japan directs a private transportation system in Kyoto and Osaka, operating more than 700 buses and taxis in dense traffic areas. The directors of the company became concerned in 1969 over the high losses resulting from accidents. The company's efficiency experts began a study of each man working for the company, trying to discover his lunar cycle of mood and efficiency. Then they adjusted schedules and routes to coincide with the best time of the month for each worker. Since then, traffic has increased, but the OMI accident rate has dropped an amazing 1/3. If monthly cycles in normal men can be damaging, what of the abnormal? Adolescent boys have been known to have monthly psychotic episodes, which may be the male equivalent of premenstrual tension. Monthly oscillations are common in manic depressive psychosis, catatonic fits, epilepsy, and its close cousin migraine. Periodic illnesses may be the effects of sudden excitement in certain regions of the brain, especially the hypothalamus, which regulates many basic body functions, such as temperature. Periodic illnesses may come from changes in the number of certain blood cells or from local swelling of tissues and skin. Concurrent fever and edema, an abnormal accumulation of fluid, also characteristic of the premenstrual syndrome in women. Periodic edema may be inherited through a dominant gene. One's ethnic group may determine one's periodic illness. Peritonitis, inflammation of the membrane that lines the abdomen, is periodic, mainly within Mediterranean ethnic groups, Jews, Armenians, Arabs. Periodic edema, however, appears to be limited to Northern European types. Limited, that is, to most of the men who run things in the United States and who try to keep our ship of state on an even keel. When Dr. Edgar Berman said that women are unfit for leadership because of raging hormonal imbalances, he neglected the role hormones play in men. In Denmark, for instance, a 16-year-old study charted the fluctuating amounts of male sex hormones in men's urine. The discovery, the ebb and flow of hormones followed a pronounced 30-day rhythm. The male hormonal balance was constantly changing. In the menstrual cycle, Katharina Dalton argues that there is no evidence for male cycles because no cyclical patterns have been found in such aspects as stool infractions, eye pain and glaucoma, blood pressure, and lower pain threshold. But Dalton inadvertently describes another form of men's cycles, one that we might call, for lack of any other name, the vicarious cycle. Just as males sometimes feel sympathetic labor pains or COVID when their wives are giving birth, men also show symptoms when the women around them menstruate. In one case, a salesman's selling ability changed mysteriously for 1 week in every four. For 3 weeks, he averaged $200 a week in a commissions. Every fourth week, his earnings fell to around $50. During the weeks his earnings were low, he became more depressed and started to work later. When he checked his wife's menstrual record, he found that his low week coincided with her premenstrual symptoms, irritability, and fatigue. Another man had chronic bronchitis with periodic intensifications correlating with his wife's period. After she had an ovarian cyst removed, his periodic attacks disappeared. In a British study of industrial workers, some men had monthly spells of lateness. These, it turned out, occurred when his wife or mother had overslept or was slower than usual preparing sandwiches or breakfast because of her menstrual cycles. In these instances, the sharing of household duties clearly would have benefited both sexes. Even children may react vicariously to their mother's periods. Dalton's study in children brought to a doctor's office with colds found that 50% were brought by their mother while she was in the 4 days before or during menstruation. In one case, 3-year-old Keith had colds every month, coinciding with his mother's menstruations. Dalton, in effect, sees the mother as the cause of the child's illness. It is possible, however, that mothers at that time of the month are simply more concerned about their offspring's well being, more likely to fuss over them, more likely to take them to the doctor. It is undeniable that there are male cycles. Scientific evidence points to biological circadian, monthly, and emotional rhythms. But there is also an imaginative and appealing cyclic theory that has had its own ups and downs in popularity over the years. Occasionally, newspapers and magazines carry ads about biorhythms, claiming that the formula to be sold will teach the reader to chart his own cycle and plan his activities to his advantage. These formulas go back to the eccentric Wilhelm Flies, who in 1857 published The Rhythm of Life, Foundations of an Exact Biology. According to Flies, everyone is bisexual. The male components of this bisexuality, consisting of such traditionally male qualities as strength, endurance, and courage, is keyed to a cycle of 23 days. The female components, quote unquote, not menstrual bleeding, but a cycle of sensitivity, intuition, love, and other feelings, has a period of 28 days. Flies believe that both cycles are present in every cell and counter each other throughout life. Moreover, they are shown in the ups and downs of each person's physical and mental vitality. Okay, technical difficulties. So another man had chronic bronchitis with periodic intensifications correlating with his wife's periods. After she had an ovarian cyst removed, his periodic attacks disappeared. In a British study of industrial workers, some men had monthly spells of lateness. These, it turned out, occurred when his wife or mother had overslept or was slower than usual preparing sandwiches or breakfast because of her menstrual cycles. In these instances, the sharing of household duties clearly would have benefited both sexes. Even children may react vicariously to their mother's periods. Dalton's study in children brought to a doctor's office with colds found that 50% were brought by the mother while she was in the 4 days before or during menstruation. In one case, 3-year-old Keith had colds every month, coinciding with his mother's menstruations. Dalton, in effect, sees the mother as the cause of the child's illness. It is possible, however, that mothers at that time of the month are simply more concerned about their offspring's well being, more likely to fuss over them, more likely to take them to the doctor. It is undeniable that there are male cycles. Scientific evidence points to biological, circadian, monthly, and emotional rhythms, but there is also an imaginative and appealing cyclic theory that has had its own ups and downs in popularity over the years. Occasionally, newspapers and magazines carry ads about biorhythms, claiming that the formula to be sold will teach the reader to chart his own cycle and plan his activities to his advantage. These formulas go back to the eccentric William Fleiss, who in 1857 published The Rhythm of Life, Foundations of an Exact Biology. According to Fleiss, everyone is bisexual. The male component of this bisexuality, consisting of such traditionally male qualities as strength, endurance, and courage, is keyed to a cycle of 23 days. The female component, not menstrual bleeding, but a cycle of sensitivity, intuition, love, and other feelings, has a period of 28 days. Flies believe that both cycles are present in every cell and counter each other throughout life. Moreover, they are shown in the ups and downs of each person's physical and mental vitality. And finally, they may be used eventually to determine the date of one's death. In the 1930s, a teacher at Innsbruck added a third dimension to Fleiss's theory, a 31-day creativity cycle of mental acuteness and power. Fleiss's rather bizarre theory would have been forgotten except for Freud, who was a friend and a passionate devotee of Fleiss. Fleiss linked his 23 and 28-day cycles with the changes in the mucosal lining of the nose. He spoke of the genital cells in the interior of the nose and related nasal irritation to neurotic symptoms and sexual abnormalities. His treatment, diagnosing ills by inspecting the nose and applying cocaine to its interior. Fleiss even operated twice on Freud's nose. The main objection to Fleiss's theories is this: there is no proof that they correspond with reality in any way. Like remarks about hormonal imbalances, they may represent a wish fulfillment, as a desire to create order through pigeonholing men and women into biological models. Although Dr. Berman envisioned hazardous possibilities if a menopausal president had presided over the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, many American presidents have survived hormonal and or cyclical disabilities. Thomas Jefferson had periodic migraines. Abraham Lincoln had periodic depressions. At least one writer suggested that Richard Nixon's raging hormonal imbalances may have caused the Watergate morass. Even John F. Kennedy, who did preside over the Cuban Missile Crisis, had a serious hormonal disorder, Addison's disease, adrenal insufficiency. Moreover, a man old enough to be eligible for the presidency is liable to be in worse physical health than his female counterpart. Not only does she live longer, but her menopause is likely to be more manageable than his, if only because it has been more fully observed and understood. More has been written about the male menopause than about any other aspect of the male cycle. For women, their menopause is more immediately obvious, an end to monthly bleeding. Psychologically, of course, it is complicated by other factors. Society's devaluing older women, in part because they are no longer youthfully beautiful, the woman's losing her children to adulthood. For a man, the menopause or male climacteric, the words are used interchangeably, is more insidious. The men are likely to be at the height of their careers, but at the same time, there is a decrease, usually gradual, in the secretion of testosterone, the male hormone. There are also the usual fears of death and aging. What are the symptoms of the male menopause? Loss of sexual potential is one, almost certainly traceable to the decline in testosterone production. By the time a man reaches age 65, he may require medical assistance to continue a full sex life. Not only does the menopausal male lose sexual potency, but he is also characterized by indecisiveness, irritability, vasomotor troubles, the contraction and dilation of blood vessels, general ineptness, insecurity, and uncertainty. The sexual changes of the male climacteric are perhaps the most worrisome to him because they most closely involve his quote unquote manhood. In our years in colleges and universities, we have observed a particular syndrome that seems characteristic of the male menopause in academia. At about the time a man becomes a full professor with tenure in his early or middle 40s, say, he usually begins attending academic conventions more frequently and without his wife. At the conventions, he seeks out young women to tell them, "My wife doesn't understand me." Or if he's trying to be more hip, he explains about his quote unquote open marriage. He mentions that he's in a position to hire new faculty and that he wants to interview the young woman for the job in his room or for lunch or for dinner, but at some point in his room. When he returns home, he often becomes the mentor of his female students who are flattered by his attention. He may seek out new young women each semester, or he may shed his old wife for a new one, marrying a student 20 years his junior. For a while at least, he has come to terms with his own aging. Not seeing across from him the woman who aged along with him, he is not reminded of his own bodily changes. At the height of his career, his increase in power serves as a partial substitute for a decrease in potency. Hence, the male academic successfully weathers his crises. Successful men in all professions have played this familiar role for themselves and the women in their lives. We don't know what happens to those less successful ones who have to suffer the same physical diminutions without the protecting emoluments of money and status, or what happens to the women they leave behind. Perhaps because men who run the scientific establishment would prefer to deny the existence of male cycles, there has been a little research done on the subject. Men, because of their socially conditioned role, find it more comfortable to believe they are as constant as the northern star. But it would benefit us all to know more about the forces controlling us. As the old saw goes, time and tide wait for no man. But if we understand the time and the tide, perhaps we can be waiting for them. Afterward to part 7, men. Throughout this book, we have seen numerous examples of the male desire to define menstruation, to become intimately involved in this exclusively female experience. Stephen King imagines Sue's blood coursing down her thighs, whereas Lauren Sanders imagines Zoe's menstrual cramps and her ensuing violence. Few men, however, have actually emulated menstruation to the point of physically mutilating their bodies. Imaginary participation in the menstrual process, what we call sagnad, seems perfectly adequate to most of them. The Wogio of New Guinea are rare exceptions, like the society studied by Bruno Bettelheim. The Wogyo people of New Guinea practice subincision, the splitting of the penis to resemble the female organs. In the Island of Menstruating Men, a remarkable book which escaped our notice in 1976, Ian Hodgman describes the ritual. At dawn, the male catches a crab or crawfish and keeps one sharp claw. After fasting all day, he goes to the beach and gets an erection, either by thinking about desirable women or by masturbation. Then he pushes back the foreskin and hacks at the glands, first on the left side, then on the right. The ceremony over, the male goes into seclusion for several days, and he abstains from intercourse until the next new moon. The male induces menstruation frequently, but not every month. Hogben observes, for this would curtail the growth of the population. Whereas Bettelheim examines subincision in light of the male's desire to emulate woman's procreative powers. Hogben explains male menstruation as a periodic disinfection. Menstruation naturally frees women from contamination. Men can purify their bodies only through an artificial bloodletting in imitation of the menstrual process. The practice of subincision is hardly universal, being limited to certain tribesmen in Australia and New Zealand. Hogben did his anthropological work many years ago in 1934 and then briefly in 1948. With the continued modernization of these cultures, the rituals performed in imitation of women's menstrual privilege are likely to disappear completely. If males everywhere wanted to menstruate, however, subincision would become a sacrament. If all men wanted to menstruate, then the Wogyo of New Guinea would be the world's model surgeons, the world's greatest philosophers. If men wanted to menstruate, then the crab and the crawfish would become objects of veneration. And here in America, generation after generation of insurance salesmen and truck drivers and male novelists would practice subincision at periodic intervals on our beaches, then retire to their clubs for 2 or 3 days of solitude. There is great satisfaction in knowing that in some exceptional cultures, men grant enormous privilege to menstruation, a biological function which they have almost universally feared and devalued. Conclusion: lifting the curse. The long silence has been broken. Menstruation is ceasing to be a subject for whispered confidences, muttered during the seclusion of slumber parties and coffee clutches. Not only are women beginning to talk to each other frankly and casually about their common bond, contemporary feminist artists are forcing us literally to look at our bleedings. Today, menstruation appears as theme or subject in the graphic arts, in painting and sculpture, in feminist comic strips, and in minstrel shows of all kinds. Despite the menstrual taboos of the primitives, visual representations of the period are actually very old. Menstruation, pregnancy, and birth appear in prehistoric rock drawings of North America, and there is some evidence that ancient peoples may have used the menstrual cycle for telling time. According to Bart Jordan, various menstrual notations help the ancients keep track of weeks and months. The notations include arrow strokes, rosets, and square framed symbols. Examples of these notations have been found in the Old World and from eras thousands of years later in Native American sites. The menstrual notation symbol frequently used to denote two fortnights bears some resemblance to two frogs sitting back to back with the moon between them. The frogs have what Jordan calls womb like body lines. Out of this figure, according to Jordan, developed the prototypical female fertility figure, the Statopagus Venus, with her exaggerated breasts, hips, and thighs. Jordan sees this new design as evidence of the sophistication of ancient artists and mathematicians. For us, it is a sign of the hold menstruation had on the primitive mind. It was not enough to record menstrual data as if recording meant control of the mysterious process. The period also had to be domesticated into art. The menstrual symbol transformed into woman transformed into woman in her most acceptable role. At least one modern artist has tried to return to folklore and found menstruation. Faith Wilding, who has exhibited her work in California, was raised in Paraguay and became interested in what she calls female mythology, especially its very primitive sources. Her constructions use such symbols as eggs, rocks, shells, and blood. Some use the form of the Venus of Willendorf, the best known Statopagus Venus. Wilding particularly Wilding particularly uses the triangle as a symbol of the vagina. She rejects the idea of female mystery, but instead tries to make the blood rituals of women, menstruation, pregnancy and birth, lactation, and menopause into rites invested with magic. As feminist art historian Arlene Raven suggests, Wilding is concerned with transubstantiation to the body and blood of the spirit. In one Wilding construction, grass skirts cover but do not conceal a triangular form, open in the center, with the suggestion of blood hanging from it. Wilding's forms are a return to the past, perhaps to an Amazon nation, but it is Judy Chicago, as a Californian, who is most responsible for the breaking of the menstrual taboo in modern art. No folklore could be as striking as Chicago's handmade lithograph, Red Flag, 1971. Chicago's intent was frankly political. She wrote us, I wanted to validate overt female subject matter in the art community and chose to do so by making Red Flag as a handmade litho, which is a high art process usually confined to much more neutralized subject matter. By using such overt content in this form, I was attempting to introduce a new level of permission for women artists, and it really worked. Red Flag is at first shocking, a red flag designed to enrage puritanical souls. The picture, in tones of pink and gray and black, shows one nude female leg softly shadowed. The other leg is obscured by a hand that is removing a reddened tampon by pulling on the string. Although the average woman may perform this ritual thousands of times in her lifetime, she probably has never seen it pictured. She probably has never watched another woman remove a tampon. Thus does an act most of us would class simply as personal acquire the dimensions of a taboo. Judy Chicago's later theories have become a focus for much controversy, centering on her insistence that round, pulsating, womb like forms, such as the frog like figures Bart Jordan discovered, are an intrinsically female imagery. What is undeniable is that Chicago has made an enormous contribution to freeing women artists from the menstrual taboo, not only in Red Flag, but in her classes at Fresno State, the California Institute of the Arts, and the Feminist Studio Workshop, in which she encourages students to express their feelings about womanhood through art. At Cal Arts, she, Faith Wilding, and about 20 other women artists constructed Woman House, convincing an elderly woman to donate an old ramshackle house to them. They transformed it into a grand symbol of female culture. In the kitchen, there are aprons in the shape of breasts and lips. Fried eggs are transformed to breasts. In the nursery, there are androgynous toys built larger than usual to give adults the feeling of smallness children have. In the closet, there are hundreds of shoes, including spike heels decorated with real spikes. In one bedroom, a woman sits endlessly applying makeup to her face. Another bathroom became Judy Chicago's menstruation bathroom. The room is covered with a gauze veil and is white, clean, and deodorized. On a shelf of Armadas and Tampax boxes. The wastebasket overflows with used napkins. On the floor, a saturated tampon lurks. Judy Chicago has written, however we feel about our own menstruation is how we feel about seeing its image in front of us. Chicago reports to us that men are especially fascinated with menstruation bathroom. She ties their interest to what happens to boys in adolescence. They identify with their mothers but are forced by social pressure to make an identification with men. This is symbolized for many men by that moment in school when the girls are taken into the other room and shown a film on menstruation, the secret, so to speak, puberty ritual that separated the boys from the girls. Seeing the bathroom was a connection to the mother, to the female, to that which has been forbidden to them. Although Chicago is interested in men's responses to her menstruation bathroom, she and other contemporary feminist artists are more concerned with liberating women's creative potential from the cultural censorships imposed on purely female experiences. Judith Jurasek, for example, titles her sculptural weaving "The Subject is Taboo." Her piece, which hangs from the ceiling, is large and in the colors of menstrual fluid, bright blood red to black and dark maroon. A furry covering sits over dark blood red pods or drops of stuffed vinyl, along with long black and red yarn fringes. The overall shape is a modified mound, narrow at the top, wide at the base. It symbolizes both the placenta of birth and the blood of menstruation, two aspects of uniquely female life. Its womb like form is the kind of female imagery Judy Chicago discusses. Mary Beth Edelson's Blood Mysteries invites women to participate in the artwork. The figure of a powerfully built nude woman with a circle around her abdomen and flowing hair surrounded her head is drawn on a wall above a real wooden box that is divided into four compartments: menstruation stories, blood power stories, menopause stories, and birth stories. Women viewing the piece were asked to contribute their experiences on the topics and place their stories in the box. Women generally expressed pleasure with the chance to share their experiences. Much hostility came from men. One of the blood power stories contributed is about the takeovers of the Whitney Museum in New York by women artists. The protesters had been objecting to the Whitney's evident sexism and giving scant attention to the work of women artists, and protests have been annual events since 1970. What is rarely mentioned in media reports is the women's symbolic actions, strewing raw eggs around the galleries and festooning the Whitney with tampons. But the Center for Minstrel Shows in America is hardly New York, it is California, especially the Los Angeles area. Isabel Welsh, a political science student at the University of California, has created a traveling theater piece, Menstrual Blood. Two writer artists in Laguna Beach have produced the hilariously raunchy Tits and Clits Woman Space, a gallery and all around meeting center for LA women, has sponsored menstruation weekends. Welsh's, Welsh's Minstrel Show, the first event of the menstruation weekend, is a 30-minute tape collage of women talking about their menstruation experiences, mixed with readings on the subject from Doris Lessing, Mary McCarthy, and Colette, and short quotations about menstrual pollution in so called primitive societies. Simultaneously, Technicolor slides are flashed on three screens of Welsh using Kotex, Tampax, Tassaway, spray deodorants, dishes, etc. Lots of blood and very graphic. The piece is broken in the middle with a woman in a white jacket who reads a brief, dry medical statement on the physiology of menstruation. After the tape and slides are finished, there is a ritual ending, the symbolic tasting of menstrual blood. Welsh sees her piece as presenting a positive ritual for a confused secular society. She uses her material to help others get at their true feelings about body images. Like Chicago Edelson and the other feminist artists, she seeks to have all women liberated from menstrual taboos. Less serious than Welsh, but perhaps in its way more striking, is the Menses is the Message, one of the stories in Tits and Clits, an adult comic book. Mary Multiperry, the heroine of the story, feels a general depression, then realizes it's merely premenstrual tension. Because all is explained, she feels cheerful again. Mary then suffers through all the taboo torments we've been exploring in this book. There are no directions on how to insert two tampons at one time. The tampons leak too easily and must be changed constantly, especially with an IUD. Carnivorous hemophile dogs chase Bloody Mary down the street. Finding herself broke and still menstruating, Mary tries to wash her used sanitary napkins in the laundry. Unfortunately, she becomes absorbed in a Wonder Woman comic, pondering the question, does Wonder Woman work during her period? And her napkins disintegrate in the washer. But then Lucky Mary finds a Berkeley book by Alicia Grapevine, a sister, obviously a reference to Alicia Bay Laurel's Living on the Earth, that tells her to cut a rubber sponge to size. Mary carves her sponge into a phallus and exults in how good it feels. She decides to wear it all for time for that nice feeling of being loved, quote unquote. Delighted with her discovery, Mary decides to have a party for her women friends, and they all cut sponges for menstrual use. Mary says the men would say we're having a poker game. Mary's friend is more outspoken when she tries on the sponge. The hell with the old man. This is fun. In the final panels, Mary and her friends do a sisterly cheer and dance. No more cotton, no more hooks, no more box boys knowing looks. Tits and clits may provoke outrage or applause, but like Judy Chicago's Red Flag and Isabel Welsh's Ritual Blood Tasting, it is a great breakthrough toward ending menstrual taboos. Furthermore, its jaunty drawing style and dialogue suggests possibilities for releasing more and more of the embarrassed laughter that fills the air when women furtively share their common experiences. When we became involved with this book, we felt like Judy Chicago, like Isabel Welsh, like all the feminist artists, that we needed a ritual of female culture to inspire us. There were no precedents, so we created our own, a bleed-in. We chose Friday, July 13th, 1973, for our bleed-in because Friday, the number 13, and the full moon it shone on us that night are all ancient female symbols. By chance, 13 women attended the party held at Mary James's house in Baltimore. For the occasion, Mary Jane had decorated the bathroom with the signs and symbols of menstruation. Large paper flowers were hanging from the mirror and the door. Stained pads, tomato sauce, were lying at random on the floor. Near the red wastebasket lay a pair of white pants with a red Friday stitched on the front and a telltale stain on the crotch, meant to recall the high school myth that a girl who wore red on Friday had the rag on. Red yarn dangled from the rim of the toilet, and Erica Jong's poem, Gardener, was pasted on the door. On the wall was a piece of paper titled Menstrual Graffiti, on which women wrote such witticisms as "We all need someone to bleed on," woman's place is in the bathroom, and vampire to school teacher, see you next period. In the living room, we all sat in a circle, a female womb like form. By chance, the two women who were menstruating were sitting a half circle apart, so everyone was encircled by them. We told anecdotes of our first periods and discovered three of us were wearing white when it came. Two were at camp. All had feelings of helplessness and embarrassment. Some had never shared those experiences before, despite years of consciousness raising groups. We toasted our stories with the drink of the evening, a Bloody Mary. Later in the evening, we viewed the educational films from Modest and Kotex and the videotape of eight older women discussing menopause. Watching the movies together removed the last traces of self consciousness by giving an ordinary focus to this extraordinary event. By the end of the evening, it became clear to the three of us, especially, that our bleed in had given a new meaning to our idea of sisterhood. We had brought together in the city of Baltimore 13 American women to share menstrual experiences and gain self awareness. But we had also brought those 13 women together with their sisters in ancient Cambodia, prehistoric New Guinea, contemporary Israel. Beneath the hilarity and irreverence of the evening was a solemn celebration of women's mysteries, an attempt to honor what is generally defiled, to raise to consciousness what has been repressed in fear for millennia. That we had so much fun at our rights in a positive sign that we succeeded. We believe that this generation of women will ultimately exorcise the curse over us all as we pass Eve's blessing onto our daughters. Afterward, if the bleed in were held today, it would probably be called a brood in, as 13 women who have finished child rearing and are eagerly looking forward to the menopause sit around a bowling alley and complain about their PMS. They read aloud from the third deadly sin between strikes and promise to testify for the PMS defense at each other's trials. They toast each other with Virgin Marys since alcohol is fattening and exacerbates their PMS symptoms. Or 13 women somewhere between puberty and the first child sit around the conference room of a 250-person law firm, of which they are all junior associates. They promise that they will never reveal to each other or to the other members of the firm, all male, that menstrual periods exist by any absence from work, irrational behavior, or tears. They take decaffeinated herbal tea together and repair to their aerobics classes. If neither scenario was in our crystal ball 10 years ago, the seeds for such images were, if only because the women in the bowling alley have always represented one half of the prevailing attitude towards menstruation and women's capacities. Menstruation is a drag, while the young lawyers represent the other half. Menstruation can't prevent me from doing my job like a man. The first edition of The Curse painstakingly explored both attitudes and tried to reveal their roots and flaws. Celebrating a quote unquote bleed in was our effort to introduce a third side, creating a female triangle of choice. While this edition continues those efforts by presenting some of the other kinds of choices women now have, choices of treatment, therapies, and physical regimens to bring even the most unpleasant menstrual symptoms under women's control. But what, we wonder, would be reported if another book on menstruation were to leak its way onto the literary scene in 2001? Would revisionism still be the norm? Would we all be living in menstrual huts of the mind or body, still wondering if the latest technological advance in menstrual protection would kill us? Would menstrual protection itself have reverted to its primeval meaning or of protecting the society from menstruation's evil influence? Or would we have seen a decade of light and understanding of the essential mystery of women's bodily rhythms revered and celebrated? If the work of two of the people we told you about in the first edition were to be the millennium's harbinger, there would be no doubt of a change for the better. Judy Chicago continues to raise red flags, but with her stunning installations, The Dinner Party and The Birth Project, raises them in far vaster skies. In both of these, she has moved from menstrual images per se and into a total confrontation with the realities of women's bodies and the minds that live in them. The Dinner Party is a massive triangular table setting celebrating 39 women of myth, legend, and history, 13 to a side, using the womanly arts of ceramics and needlework to illustrate their actual contributions and symbolic importance. Most of the designs, especially on the dinner plates, emanate from vulval representations made fantastic by their reach into art. A deliberate play on the Last Supper of the New Testament, which also had 13 guests. The dinner party simultaneously represents women's accomplishments and their struggles. The women are honored guests at the party, but in a sense, they are also trapped on the plates. eaten alive, quote unquote, and erased from history. The Birth Project contains huge wall hangings of needlework graphically depicting the realities and agonies of childbirth, often confronting the viewer at eye level with a child emerging from the womb. These images are not menstrual, but they do bring women face to face with images of their anatomy, which has universally been called their destiny. Vital to an understanding of Chicago's intention is the realization that she has employed hundreds of needle women and ceramic painters in both projects. In this way, does the process itself become the art and the installations ironic, as well as literal depictions of women's work. Meanwhile, Bart Jordan, whom we came to know during the writing of this edition, has gone further back into the recesses of human history than almost anyone writing or thinking today to prove that at least 30,000 years ago, and perhaps 300 years ago, human beings on this planet were measuring the movement of the stars and planets with a sophisticated system that emanated from and mathematically depended upon the human menstrual cycle. Drawing on his knowledge of Ice Age art and prehistoric musical notation, complemented by knowledge of some 20 languages, Greek, Mesopotamian, and Hebraic myth, and a relentless curiosity, he has performed leaps of the imagination to arrive at diagrams and symbols based on the 364-day year of 13 moon cycles, the 280-day human gestation period, and the 584-day transit of the planet Venus around the sun, only to find time and again that the diagrams already existed on the carved aspuges and believed to be the artistic expressions of a primitive and pre-literate people. Jordan's work is too complicated to reproduce here. It has been published imperfectly in various places. We have seen his drawings and examined the evidence of the archaeological finds only to agree with the staggering fact he is trying to introduce into current scientific thinking. It is this, the Ice Age art, that is commonly displayed, and the even earlier art known to paleontologists and other specialists is really Ice Age science. The ancients, the Cro Magnon ancestors of our human race, were not scratching pretty designs onto their reindeer tusks or fashioning grotesque models of the female form to give vent to their need to make art. They were, in fact, recording their scientific observations on the way the moon and planets and their own Earth went through the phases of the year and using the menstrual clock of the women of the society as the observable data from which to draw. Crucial to Jordan's calculations is the difference between the lunar and menstrual calendars. The real lunar calendar, he says, counting the nights when the moon is dark, is 29 and a half days, but the calculations evident in the carved tusk and obese goddesses reflect a calendrical notation of 28 days and its multiple 280. The human gestation period. Menstrual averaging was not unknown to our Cro Magnon ancestors. Jordan believes, and it was this sophistication that enabled them to create symbols in their art, such as the early Greek Minder, that were actually representations of the movement of time as measured by the female body clock and its numerical connection to the travels of Venus around the sun. Today, this kind of primordial evidence of harmony with the universe strikes a richer chord with us as we look at the infinitesimal moment in human history that is the last 2,000 years. Going from the ridiculous to the sublime, as it were, how can we not celebrate our rhythms, knowing that they have marked the rhythms of the earth and skies for millennia? A greater leap of faith and transcendence is possible for women now if they will embrace the blood, see beyond its messy interference with daily life, and take pride in the mark of the universe it has placed upon them. The end. And with that, thank you all again for listening. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Um, we have come to the end of another lovely reading session. Again, I pray that someone has been edified in wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And may the Creator continue to rain down blessings upon the righteous, and may the righteous continue to stand up for love. As always, have a beloved, blessed rest of your day, and no matter what, let peace be your place. This is your sister Chaya. Love you all more than you know. I am you, and you are me. Together, we are family. All right, y'all, I'm gone. Shalom.